Welcome to the third installation of World Land Protection and Zoocheck's Wild Among Us webinar series, addressing exotic animal issues pertaining to the trade, regulation, seizure, and sheltering of exotic animals as pets, and the associated animal welfare, public health and safety, and environmental risks. This is your third session joining us, or if your first session joining us, welcome. My name is Cassandra Conan, and I'm the Global Head of the Exotic Pet Campaign here at World Animal Protection, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. So Zoocheck and World Animal Protection are two organizations working on exotic pet issues here in Canada and around the world. World Animal Protection is a global charity whose mission is to move the world to protect animals. We use evidence-based research, we expose animal welfare issues, and work collaboratively with a range of stakeholders to identify and deliver positive, sustainable change. And Zoocheck is a Canadian-based international wildlife protection charity established in 1984 to promote and protect the interests and well-being of wild animals, free roaming in nature and held in captivity. Working with a broad range of collaborating partners across Canada and around the world, Zoocheck endeavors to promote animal protection in specific situations and strives to bring about a new respect for all living things and the world in which we live. So we have a great lineup of speakers for you today over the next few hours. You'll notice along the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. Please click here if you have any questions for any of our speakers as we go along. And we'll be taking questions for about 10 minutes after each speaker has concluded. And then if we do have time, although we haven't found that that's the case, we can open it back up at the end of the session for whoever's still here. I also want to let you know that we're going to be taking a stretch break for 5-10 minutes after the second speaker. And so let's kick off the session. Our first speaker is Rob Laidlaw. Rob is the Executive Director of Wildlife Protection at Zoocheck. He's also a chartered biologist and a former Humane Society inspector and a past project manager for World Animal Protection. His work has involved a wide variety of investigations, legislative campaigns, legal actions, capacity building programs, and animal rescues here in Canada and around the world. And Rob is also an award-winning author of 10 children's books, which we need lots of about animal welfare and wildlife protection, as well as numerous other publications. And in 2014, he was awarded the prestigious Frederick McGrand Lifetime Achievement Award for substantial contribution to animal welfare in Canada, which was well deserved. So Rob, welcome, and I'm going to turn over control to you.
Okay, thank you, Cass. As all of you out there can see, that we've decided for this group of sessions today to go with the most exciting and sexiest topic first. Well, actually, some of my colleagues, when I told them that I was talking about municipal bylaws, or primarily about municipal bylaws today, they said it would be too boring to listen to. I said, well, not so. I said, it'll be fascinating. Well, I have to admit that maybe not fascinating to them, but that's what I told them, so hopefully they've tuned in. I do want to apologize in advance. I do have something that's unusual for me, which are a few text-heavy slides. And I will admit that they'll reduce the excitement level from 99% down to 98%. So keep that in mind as I move forward through the presentation. All jokes aside, I really do think bylaws can be fascinating and exciting. I remember campaigning for a local bylaw prohibiting the use of wild animals in circuses in Toronto in the early 1990s. That certainly was exciting, and it was the first major North American city to ban the use of wild animals in circuses and similar kinds of acts. And it set the stage for many other jurisdictions that followed it. Unfortunately, that particular initiative ended up being rendered moot because it was overturned on a technicality based on the types of government we had in Toronto at the time. But it was in place for close to 2 years. But it was the first time. That was kind of exciting. I've been involved in all kinds of campaigns across the country, as Cass mentioned, dozens and dozens of them, from coast to coast to coast, dealing with bylaw changes to address the keeping of wild animals in slum zoos and circuses and novelty acts and pseudo sanctuaries, and certainly to address issues pertaining to the keeping of exotic pets in people's homes. And there's a lot of very colorful stories when you're doing work on bylaws. I remember a lady who had a tiger in her backyard, and her husband, whenever visitors came over, would actually pry open the tiger's mouth and put his head in there. He thought it was hilarious. I don't know if he's still alive. They disappeared. I remember another fellow, this was in Toronto many years ago, who kept 7 cougars in his basement. And then I encountered later another guy who kept an adult cougar in his tool shed in his backyard, and the only security was a propped up shovel against the shed door to keep it closed. Some very bizarre situations. So it can be very fascinating. And certainly for anybody who's involved in bylaw development or enforcement within a municipality, you'll understand just how critical that bylaws are. They govern so many things in our communities, and we really couldn't live without them. And if you've never really thought about bylaws and how widespread they are, how they influence our lives, and you're interested in helping animals, keep bylaws in the back of your mind, because certainly most of us are familiar with bylaws that apply to dogs and cats. But if we're looking to help exotic animals as well, bylaws can be a fantastic vehicle for making change happen that benefits exotic animals. Now, I will say up front, I do think that many times exotic animal bylaws are a bit better at preventing problems than they are at dealing with existing problems. But they are critical and they are a useful tool in the toolbox. And many times, for depending on the issues and the circumstances, because there are a lot of variables, many times they can be the solution to particular kinds of problems. I wanted to start by talking just a little bit about a bylaw case that occurred a number of years ago. And this illustrates some of what I've just talked about. But if you look up at the tiger looking out of the screened in segment of that barn, you'll see that's a tiger that was kept as a pet in southwestern Ontario. And this particular tiger was one of 5 or 6 cats owned by a private individual in the township of Southwold. And this private individual had kept these cats for quite a number of years, and neighbors were quite justifiably alarmed at the presence of these cats, and there were other issues, and the town was going to respond to the presence of these cats that they had in prior times just basically ignored. Now, one of my colleagues at Zoocheck went down when we had heard about the complaints and spoke to the legal department in this municipality and said, well, these big cats have been there for quite a long time. And we think, based on our experience, that you're going to have a tough time getting them out. You'll probably have to grandfather them. So you should actually put in a bylaw that sets out very stringent safety conditions that at least mitigate or address in whole some of the concerns expressed by neighbors. And the town didn't do that, and they put in a bylaw that basically banned these animals. The owner said that he was going to challenge it. Well, what happened around about that time was that a young boy, this was in 2004, and forgive me for anybody who knows this very well, it may have been just before the bylaw was put in. A young boy was on the property, and a tiger was being leash walked. The tiger attacked him, and he had severe injuries to his head and neck. Well, the bylaw was passed, banning the animals. The owner fought the bylaw, and he won because the municipality really should have grandfathered the animals and set up a very stringent safety protocols and requirements for the safe containment of these cats. But they didn't, and the owner fought it and he won. And then in 2010, the owner was killed by one of his tigers, and the cats were dispersed to wherever. We don't know exactly where. I think that's a cautionary tale, and there are many others out there about bylaws and how to approach them. And I really think they are useful, but we have to keep a number of things in mind. And I'm going to be talking about some of those things. And hopefully some of them, if you're already involved in bylaw enforcement, will be new or novel and will make you maybe think about things in a different way, or maybe it might enhance what you're doing. And for those of you who are animal campaigners, it might familiarize you more with this tool that you may not have been aware of, and certainly not aware of how powerful a tool it can be. Now, when you're looking at bylaws, if you've got bad bylaws, poorly written bylaws, they can have a lot of consequences. And when you're looking at animals, some of those consequences can be poor animal welfare, danger to public safety. I won't list all of them. I won't be reading every word on each of these slides, but I'll highlight a few. So you've certainly got danger to public safety, as was illustrated by that previous story. You've got possibly decreased property values. We hear this all the time from people who are living around exotic animals or slum zoos or other situations. The evidence we have for decreased property values, I'm not aware of anybody studying it in a comprehensive way, but it's all anecdotal. But certainly it's a concern that's brought up. Certainly a strain or straining municipal resources. And there's lots of other problems that can result when you have bad bylaws. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today are a few common bylaw issues, goals, a little bit about regulations and standards, accreditation, listings, exemptions, and then a few ideas about how we can move forward to make our bylaws better. So some of the common bylaw issues that we encounter, and we've dealt with, like I said earlier, dozens and dozens and dozens of bylaws. We've surveyed bylaws, and there are several sort of key components when you're looking at exotic animals. And those components are regulations, exemptions, and listings. And what we find is that there's no harmonization across a region or a province, or certainly nationally when you look at bylaws. While there are some commonalities, there are a lot of differences. Even in things as basic as a definition of animal, you'll find that, you know, one jurisdiction will define animal as being you know, mammals, birds, and reptiles, and they forget all the other animals. Others will list all those other animals, but say excluding fish. You'll get all these different definitions. And really, if we want an effective benchmark or baseline for exotic animal bylaws, we should look at some level of harmonization of certainly the most used terms. You find bylaws that are outdated, and certainly both Zoocheck, my organization, and World Animal Protection has advocated for the use of positive list regulation. We feel that the old prohibited list or negative list type of regulatory regime is outdated. And certainly some of the other provisions that you find in bylaws are outdated. Another issue that we've discussed previously, as has World Animal Protection, is that bylaws tend not to be inclusive enough, and I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. And because they're not inclusive enough, they leave major exotic animal problems unaddressed. And many of those problems are not really the focus of bylaws, but many problems can be addressed, at least in part, through bylaws. But there are many problems that are left unaddressed. There's technical inaccuracies. Last night I went through about 20 bylaws just looking at the list, and you find all kinds of mislabeling of animals, their species names, their genus, their family, their order. You find a lot of inaccuracies and sloppy wording where, you know, instead of Perissodactylus ungulates, and that's just the technical name for one branch of the ungulates. They'll have spelling mistakes where they'll say Larissodactylus, and there are things like that that if you know about animals, you know about taxonomy, they're easily correctable, but they're ubiquitous throughout bylaws, or most of them. All these kinds of very simple, easily correctable mistakes. You find loopholes that allow the exploitation of animals that are common in bylaws, and you find other bylaws that are very, very difficult to enforce for a variety of reasons that I'll get into in the next few minutes. Now, I do want to say right up front, and I'll probably say this several times, I do think positive list regulation, and the next speaker, Michele Hamers, will be getting into more details. I'm just going to mention positive list regulation in passing and a couple of things about it, but positive list regulation can mitigate or eliminate many of the problems I'm going to talk about. So when you're looking at municipal bylaws, there is variance from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Certainly here in Ontario, when the Municipal Act changed in the early 2000s, the ability for municipalities to exercise control over what constitutes animal control within their jurisdictions was expanded quite considerably. And in our conversations with people that are on our legal team and other consultant lawyers, that would include here in Ontario the ability for municipalities to address animal welfare, certainly human health and safety, to a certain extent, some of these other issues as well, like environmental protection, as well as their own interests, reducing nuisance issues and complaints, not having to seize animals, things like that. And I think there can be a lot of goals. Ultimately, as someone from an animal protection organization, I think my primary goal when we're looking at bylaws is animal welfare. And I think a natural extension of that, because of the way animals are kept, you often have human health and safety issues, not just physical safety, but you've got issues relating to the threat of disease coming from animals as well. And certainly in some municipalities, there is this suggestion that, well, maybe we don't need to do anything. Maybe we don't even need a bylaw other than for dogs and cats. We don't need a bylaw for these other animals because the province takes care of it. Well, that's not the case. In most cases, the province does not take care of that. Here in Ontario, we have the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act, which replaced on January 1st of 2020 our old SPCA Act. Well, that act is retroactive, and it affords only a very basic level of protection, and it isn't really something that sort of delves into the issues that you find, or many of the issues that you find on a local level. Municipal bylaws provide yet another level, and often a more detailed level of protection than many provincial laws. So I would say when you're looking at municipal bylaws, consider them essential to protecting the welfare of exotic animals, and certainly protecting human welfare, so human health and safety, because our Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act doesn't do that. So see municipal bylaws as complementary to provincial animal protection laws. And you actually see this in our provincial law here in Ontario. It says that if a municipal law is brought in that affords more protection than the provincial law, then the municipal law takes precedent. So it overrides the provisions of the provincial law. So obviously that's an indicator that the province is saying, look, if you want to do more, go ahead and do it. And it's, always something to see as complementary or enhancing whatever protections exist at other levels of government. Now, in every municipal bylaw, both Zoocheck and World Animal Protection feel that to a great extent, certainly on animal welfare and human health and safety issues, it has to be science-based. And for other issues, it has to be evidence-based. The approach should be precautionary, and everything that's done should be a proportionate response to potential issues that you might have in your community. Because if it's proportionate, then that will make it defensible. And certainly if it's science and evidence-based, that will make your bylaw defensible too. And there have been many cases where bylaws have been challenged, some successfully, some not. So if you can make your bylaw as bomb-proof as it can be, then you'll be ahead of the game. So I wanted to talk a little bit about exotic animal housing care and safety regulations. What I'm going to say might be a bit counterintuitive to some people. I'm not a big fan of very specific exotic animal standards being entrenched in municipal bylaws, and I'll explain why in a second, but I am very much a promoter of putting in animal welfare principles into bylaws so that a clear direction and philosophy is established, and that will guide further bylaw development on down the line. It will guide enforcement. It may guide the creation of other kinds of regulations within that bylaw, or even other regulations within the municipality that apply to animals. I think animal welfare principles should be included. And probably the most famous and one of the oldest frameworks for of animal welfare principles is the 5 Freedoms of Animal Welfare, and they date back to 1965. I mentioned them in a previous talk in the first session, but there are others like the 5 domains and other systems that could be incorporated. But I think it's very important to have those guiding principles, even if they're largely symbolic. Have them in your bylaw because they will set the direction, tone, and philosophy for everything that follows. I also think that there should be general standards of animal housing and care that apply to all animals. We've seen them in bylaws where the general standards of animal housing and care apply only to domesticated pets. That doesn't make any sense. Even if you face challenges with regard to enforcement, or the fact that exotic pets are in people's homes and very hard to identify and then to gain access to, it still sends a message that we have to pay attention to these animals as well. So general standards of animal housing and care should be included and should be applied to all animals in a jurisdiction. And when I say general standards of care, I mean things like providing animals with space, providing animals with proper environments to live in, providing social animals with a proper social context so that they're not living in social isolation and suffering as a result. So very general things that you can apply to one extent or another for most of the animals that you would find in a municipality. So I think those things are critical because they set the tone, they set the philosophy. Now, if you've got animals, whether they're crocodiles or tigers, like in that case I talked about earlier, that are already in a municipality and they've been in the municipality for quite some period of time, you'll be hard pressed to get rid of them. You see in most legislation, even at the provincial level here, when they made changes to the Ontario SPCA Act with regard to orca whales, they grandfathered in the existing animals. That's typically what almost every jurisdiction that we've seen has done. So if you've got animals in your community, and you don't have a bylaw and you bring in a bylaw, you probably have to set up some type of grandfathering of those animals. And I think certainly when you're looking at how to deal with those grandfathered animals, you want to ensure that other things aren't going to impact on the keeping of those animals, and maybe they will help you get particularly dangerous animals and unsavory owners. It may be something that can help force animals out, and that's zoning bylaws, licensing requirements, and things like that. We found that in a lot of cases that animals that were already in a municipality, if they weren't satisfying all the zoning requirements and other requirements, that can be a way of trying to expedite some type of resolution of the problem, often those people leaving the community. So For grandfathered animals, they should certainly apply, or they should certainly have to adhere to all the general standards of animal housing and care. And for some animals, you may have to get assistance to assess whether those standards are being met, but that can be done on a case-by-case basis. But more importantly, and it was illustrated in that first case story that I mentioned, I think for all animals that are grandfathered that are dangerous, you're quite within your rights to set certain conditions that must be met for the keeping of those animals and to ensure public health and safety. You know, you can't grandfather somebody in and have, you know, big cats behind a 2-meter high fence. You have to set safety standards. So I think that when you're looking at the grandfathered animals, think in terms of general standards of animal housing and care, and think in the case of dangerous animals of the protection of human health and safety by setting very stringent safety standards. Now, I mentioned I'm not a big fan of species-specific exotic animal care standards, and there's several reasons for that. I think that oversight and enforcement often require substantial internal expertise. If you've got a guy with 130 venomous snakes in his house, you're going to require some expertise to determine, okay, which are the venomous snakes, which are not, which, you know, how do they have to be housed? It requires a certain level of expertise that usually isn't in a municipal animal control department or any other department of the city. So when you're looking at exotic animals, and there could potentially be thousands of species that people keep in their homes or on their properties. You know, even if you have expertise about a few of them, you won't have expertise about all of them, and you will have to acquire that. It will not be there already. The expertise, if you have it or if you acquire it, may be challenged because so many exotic animals, there are a range of standards that are applied depending upon who's keeping that animal, and many of them are subjective. So unless you have the world expert, you know, some of what you're putting forward in terms of what these animals need and how they should be housed may be challenged, and we've seen that before. I mentioned earlier that access to exotic animals in private home situations may be problematic, and that may make enforcement difficult. If you've got to enforce, monitoring may be difficult and costly. It's certainly staff time to monitor, and enforcement, which may require bringing in other experts, and that may increase your costs. And ultimately, unless you've got a particularly dangerous animal, it may not eliminate the problems. You may see an uptick in the housing and care standard, but often the animal will remain and will be pretty much in the same situation. So, you know, if you have the expertise, if you have the resources, then that's one thing. But we have not encountered any municipalities yet that have the ability to go out in a very comprehensive way and assess whether species-specific exotic animal care and housing standards are actually met. But you can go out and assess safety standards because they're far more objective, and there are numerous organizations. There is the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, there's the American Zoo and Aquarium Association, the Zoological Association of America. There are many groups that are focused on particular species that have standards developed, and certainly there are standards in regulation and legislation around the world. So there's this vast amount of material with regard to safety that can be drawn upon, that's been vetted, that's been proved, that's been used successfully, that make the creation of objective safety standards easier than other kinds of standards, and certainly enforceable. So I've mentioned, I'm not going to read all these, but you know, these are for mammals. Big cats, you're looking at looking at standards for barrier design, height, construction, structural enhancements, entry gates, containment areas, service areas. You're looking at perimeter fencing. You're looking at whether there are kill rifles and tranquilizer guns on site and people that are accessible to them that have the appropriate firearms training, identification of animals. There's a whole list of things that are part of safety plans that are well within the ability of municipalities to develop and to enforce without too much cost or too much trouble. Now, a lot of people, just like with the provincial animal welfare legislation, have said, well, maybe we should just require accreditation. And certainly you see in some of the bylaws in Canada that if you're accredited by Canada's Accredited Zoos and Aquariums, CAZA, that's our private national zoo industry association, you see in bylaws that if you're accredited by CAZA, then you're exempt. And it's a tool that can be used. Certainly accreditation is a tool that can be used, but it's not going to solve exotic pet problems because CAZA, the Zoo Industry Association, doesn't accredit private exotic wild animal pet keepers. So right from the get-go, you've got an industry association that only accredits public display facilities. And when you look at their accreditation program, you'll see that it's not really as responsive as one would hope when you're dealing with issues on a local level. So if there was an inspection of a facility that's in a municipality, you know, and that inspection leads to accreditation, well, the next inspection for that accredited business or institution would be 5 years down the road. A lot can happen in between. The accreditations are announced, so facilities prepare for them. They are private, so unless the facility or business being accredited agrees to let the results of the accreditation inspection out into the public, they're entirely private. So there's no real accountability, no transparency, and there are a number of other problems. So I would say that accreditation can be a tool at times, not only with CAZA, but with some of the other organizations that do accreditation as well. But it's not the answer. We still need bylaws that address a whole range of circumstances that create a fair and even playing field. So I've gone through a little bit about regulations. Like I said, general standard of care, not a big fan of species-specific standards for municipalities, and big fan of safety standards for dangerous species. So the next sort of foundational tenet of exotic animal bylaws, or the components of animal control bylaws that deal with exotic animals, are lists. And I mentioned earlier, I think positive list regulation is the way to go. And there are many reasons for that. Positive lists, for any of you who don't know, they're often called white lists or permitted lists. They're simply lists of animals that are allowed to be kept without any license permit by members of the public. And if you have a positive list, no animals are legal unless they were on the list. So if you've got 20 animals on your positive list or 100 animals that are on your positive list, well, any of the other 60 or 70,000 species of animals that are out there in the world today, they're not allowed, at least not at that time when you're looking at that list. Positive lists are concise and easy to understand, because if the criteria for inclusion on your list are robust, then your list is very short. If all you're doing is saying, we're going to only put animals that are not dangerous on the list, then your list is going to be hundreds and hundreds of pages long. But if the criteria for inclusion are robust, they're concise and easy to understand, they're preventative or precautionary in nature. So they're better for animal welfare, human safety, environmental protection, because to get on a positive list, you typically have a range of criteria that have to be met. So before anything is allowed, they have to be vetted according to the process that is in the jurisdiction. And those criteria for inclusion on the list can be catered to a certain extent to individual jurisdictional circumstances. So if you're in an area where there is no veterinary care for reptiles or no veterinary care for birds or no ability for shelters to take any of these animals in, that can be included in your inclusion criteria for your positive list. So there is an ability to adapt to local or regional circumstances. One of the best things about positive lists is that they put the burden of proof on anyone who wants to keep or use these animals, and the burden of proof relates to whether or not those animals satisfy the inclusion criteria. So it puts the burden of proof on them. Right now, if you have a prohibited list and you want to add something on there, well, the municipality has to do all the work, do all the research, get the experts, create the case, or NGOs like mine or like World Animal Protection has to expend all these energy and resources. And then we have to fight tooth and nail to get even one animal on a list. If you have a positive list, then you have these criteria. And if someone wants to put lizard A or snake X or mammal Q on the list, they have to do the work. And then that is assessed by the municipality. So the municipality is in more of a power situation than they were previously. And the other great thing about positive lists is that it may seem, if you're a policymaker or you're in an animal control department, oh God, am I going to have all this work, switching everything over? I'd like to do this. It really has merits, but it's just too much work. Well, you can actually do positive lists within existing prohibited list frameworks. And in fact, that's something we advocate for, and it has been done. Now, prohibited lists are the traditional lists, and they were really started back in the time when anybody could go out into a pet store and buy a cheetah or a serval or a monkey or a capybara. And a lot of people had these animals. There were all kinds of complaints. And in response to the complaints, some of them nuisance complaints, some of them dealing with human safety, various jurisdictions, some municipal, some provincial, and some of the smaller provinces started to say, well, we've got to do something. So they would create prohibited lists and say, okay, it is unreasonable to have a tiger in that community. Everybody's all up in arms. There is this, risk of the animal escaping and killing somebody. Let's do something. And what you found is that the prohibited lists originally dealt mostly with animals that were perceived, whether that was real or imagined, to be dangerous in a physical sense to the custodians of these animals, to neighbors, to bystanders, visitors, community members, etc. So prohibited lists have been rooted in safety and safety alone. And that has changed today. Now there are other considerations, and animal welfare certainly should be one of them. So when you're looking at prohibited lists, there are a few pros. It's the strongest protection for wild animal populations because if they're not there, they're not suffering, they're not posing a danger. And that would be great if every animal, certainly from our perspective, where animals are our clients, it would be great if every one of these animals were prohibited, but we live in the real world and that's not the case. But prohibited lists, if you don't have the animal there, then in a certain way, you've got the strongest protection. Because they're not there, you don't have poor welfare outcomes in your municipality. You don't have the public health and safety concerns. You have clear enforcement guidelines. If you go and the animal's prohibited and it's there, well, obviously it shouldn't be there. And to a certain extent, it eliminates the need for local expertise. Now, that isn't necessarily the case if you walk into a reptile collecting situation where somebody's got 100 or 200 or 300 reptiles in their basement, and many of them are very similar looking, or they're color morphs of the same species. Then you're going to have challenges. But to a certain extent, a prohibited list will eliminate the need for local expertise. You don't need to be an expert on big cats. If you walk in there, lions are prohibited, and you see one, hey, it shouldn't be there. Now, the reality with prohibited list regulation shows some of the deficits, and that is one of them, and that's certainly a big one for me, is that no animals are illegal unless they're listed on the prohibited list. Unlike the positive list, who I'll say again, no animals are legal unless they're listed. So the prohibited list, no animals are illegal unless they're listed. That leaves probably about 65,000 or so species that potentially could be kept in a community, and that wouldn't be illegal. So right now there's about 700 or so species of reptile in trade. And there are about 11,371 species of reptile as of about a week ago. And the number keeps going up. Only venomous snakes, large constricting snakes, and in some cases, lizards that grow longer than 2 meters when they reach adult age are prohibited. So you've got probably 11,000 of the other reptile species that, according to the bylaw, with a prohibited list that includes only those reptiles would be allowed. So you got a lot of animals that could be allowed. The prohibited lists tend to be mammal centric. So they've dealt with the animals that were common in the pet trade decades ago that generally posed a danger. Gradually, sort of the zoo type species were added, but there's in terms of mammals, but a lot of mammals were left out. And there have been relatively few birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, or invertebrates included in any of these lists unless they're particularly dangerous. So venomous species or some animals that are poisonous. And there's a few that are have a very strong chance of them establishing themselves as invasive species if they're released, like blue crayfish. But it's been mammal centric, so most of the animals are not included. That's not right. If we're applying certain criteria to mammals, we should just apply it right across the board. That's the thing we should be doing. Birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and even invertebrates, we now know that they have cognitive, emotional, and social capacities, or at least many of them that are similar to all other animals, and we have to take that into consideration. Prohibited lists allow unfettered exploitation of new animals and new species without vetting. So someone says, okay, this prohibited list has 30 species of reptiles on it. I'm going to keep this other reptile. Maybe it's dangerous. Maybe it's not. Maybe their husbandry standards have been developed. Maybe they haven't, but I can keep it. That's not a good thing to occur. That's not good for animals. That's not good for the public. And there should be vetting of every kind of animal. It's just like with a product. If you want to put out a new toaster oven or a new car or whatever, you get it vetted, make sure it's safe, make sure all the required criteria are met. Well, the same should apply to animals. I've mentioned some of these others. The only one I will highlight is that in prohibited lists, you do get all kinds of funny things, at least funny to me as someone who is sort of entrenched in the whole animal world, but you see funny things. Some of them are these inadvertent mistakes or mislistings or misinformation. And, they're things that are correctable and can be dealt with, but they are there. So I wanted to show you, we surveyed 99 municipalities in Canada, and we did this about 4 years ago and then 2 years ago. And the lists and the bylaws change a little bit over time, but for the most part, this will still be accurate. And we looked at, in terms of the animals that are included on prohibited lists, this would be pretty much a standard prohibited list. There are variances in what animals are on them, but generally speaking, you would see Artiodactylus ungulates. I was actually surprised to see that was the highest. I would have expected it to be big cats, but hippos, camels, elk, deer. Most municipalities say, yeah, we don't want them in our communities. We don't want them in people's backyards, so they ban them. Non-human primates, all kinds of danger issues, even with small primates like macaques, but also disease issues, sheltering issues, all kinds of issues. A number of these are sort of standard, and you can see a significant number of municipalities that we surveyed out of the 99 have included many of the same kinds of animals. So the mammal list, it's not entirely comprehensive, it's reasonably comprehensive, but it does focus on these animals that are the ones that you would tend to associate with a zoo or similar kind of setting, all the way down to probably walruses, sea lions and seals, the pinnipeds. So you get these larger zoo type animals, they're prohibited. And then as you move on down the phylogenetic scale in terms of mammals, you get fewer municipalities doing anything about animals that are seemingly more innocuous, like Aranacidi, the hedgehogs. You get only 28% of municipalities that ban those, and it's usually for nuisance reasons rather than animal welfare. This last category I just thought was humorous. There were a few municipalities out of the 99 that banned all mammals. I thought that was very interesting, but you'll see here sort of the zoo type animals are banned, and many of the smaller animals, certainly many of the rodents, are not. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. When you look at birds, these are commonly what you see. You see the ratite birds, ostriches, emus, rheas, cassowaries, raptors, the waterfowl, pheasants, guinea fowl, those types of birds. There are a number of other categories for birds, but they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. So beyond these 4 categories, you don't normally see many birds considered on prohibited lists. And one of the categories of birds that actually screams out, and they do a lot of screaming when they're in home situations because they live lives of deprivation and suffering, is parrots. There's about, depending on whose taxonomic advice you believe, there are between about 354 and 390 some odd parrots. And parrots are highly intelligent, extremely gregarious, wide-ranging. They spend their entire lives with other parrots. They're just amazing animals, and no matter how you look at them, they're animals that are going to tell you, if you're open to considering it, that they are exceptionally difficult animals to keep in any kind of a home situation, yet they're completely absent. We have not seen parrots in any prohibited list that we've seen across the country. And that's because, again, that these prohibited lists were focused mainly on physical safety risks, so the risk of severe injury or death. When you look at reptiles and amphibians, you tend to get the crocodilians, so alligators, crocodiles, caiman, and gharial, that are banned. They're large, perceived to be potentially dangerous. There are some smaller species that they can still give you a smaller bite. Venomous snakes and lizards, the venomous lizards are a lot less dangerous than most of the venomous snakes, but they're perceived to be exceptionally dangerous, so they've been banned. And then the large constricting snakes, and often what many municipalities have done is just prohibit pythons or boas. I'm assuming that was largely because of the lack of knowledge about, what constitutes each of these categories of animals. You see some amphibians, some communities that ban turtles and tortoises. You see a number that ban snapping turtles, so alligator snapping turtles and common snapping turtles. And you see a few municipalities that are banning other types of animals. But for the most part, you're looking at animals that are generally considered to pose some risk or danger to human safety that are being banned. So again, like the birds, you've got a relatively small number. I mentioned that there were, as of a week or so ago, 11,341 species of reptiles. Well, this here constitutes a very small proportion of those animals. And then one thing that you see on prohibited lists that makes no sense whatsoever, it's entirely arbitrary, is this idea that snakes exceeding 2 meters, in some bylaws it says 3 meters length when adult, and lizards exceeding 2 meters are banned. And that's something that has been rooted in this idea that the bigger snakes are more dangerous, and certainly in many respects they are. But if we're looking at other types of considerations like animal welfare, the capacity of shelters to home these animals and things like that, then that list has to be drastically expanded, because this was something somebody made up, this arbitrary, non-scientific, non-defensible 3 meter and 2 meter or 2 meter and 2 meter rule. And there's a lot of that. And what we've seen is that when a large municipality like Toronto does something, that there's a lot of cutting and pasting. So municipalities that don't have policy development staff, they just cut and paste. And we've seen that when we've gotten something into a municipality, that very quickly, as other bylaws are changed, it's just copied. And that can be advantageous, but it can be to the detriment of everything as well. So prohibited lists really are not the way to go. They're cumbersome, they're difficult. Positive lists are a lot easier. The third thing I've mentioned are regulations. I've mentioned lists, or at least a little bit about them, and exemptions. And a lot of the exemptions are obvious, and they're warranted. You may want to exempt veterinary hospitals, shelters. You may have to exempt provincially or federally licensed facilities of certain kinds. You may have to grandfather a zoo. But there are exemptions that we see, and people have been putting them in their bylaws as recently as last month, that really shouldn't be there. And many of them, and in our views, some of the most serious, concern temporary zoos. We've coined an acronym called MLAP, Mobile Live Animal Program. So these are exhibits, shows, demonstrations that are mobile zoos that are taken around from place to place, and basically they go to where any location where someone has a check to pay their fee. And we've identified about 85 of them operating in Ontario. You're going to hear more about them in California. They're in the UK, they're in the United States, they're in Western Canada. And they're really a product of the ready availability of computers and the internet and animals. And here in Ontario, they are completely unregulated. And what we've seen is that a lot of bylaws just say, okay, they're educational, let's just exempt them all. So we had a case where there was a city that had done this wonderful bylaw that had banned all these kinds of animals. They had used the prohibited list, but it was very comprehensive. But they said that anybody doing a temporary exhibit, show, demonstration, display was exempt. And there was no explanation or no qualifying text with regard to what that means. And we've dealt with these for many years. And we know that if you've got something in there that is undefined, that creates an exemption, that not only are there lots of people out there that will exploit that exemption, that they probably will, at least some of them, in your jurisdiction, especially if there's a market for their product. So, there are these exemptions that create these gaping loopholes that undermine what you may have done in another part of your bylaw. So I've highlighted here in blue, I've got that one I just mentioned, temporary displays, exhibits, or shows, massive loophole. That would allow me to go in, if I had a lion, and do an educational presentation in an old folks home or whatever. Another exemption is the sites where educational programs are conducted. Sometimes it's related to a particular location or geographical setting. You've got one that was cookie cuttered from the Toronto bylaw in the 80s and 90s, where Toronto was known as Hollywood North, a lot of movies. And when we were dealing with the circus bylaw, they didn't want to touch what was going on with films because it was such an economic advantage to the city. So they set some criteria and allowed professionally produced films. And sure enough, you saw all kinds of other municipalities, including some that had never had a film filmed in their municipalities, probably ever, that were including this exemption. But it allows people to come in because professionally produced film sites or film productions isn't defined. So it creates an exemption. Another one that we've seen quite readily is, or quite a lot, is anyone holding a license issued by provincial or federal government permitting the keeping of animals. Well, that would allow anyone with a migratory birds permit to keep any kind of animal they want in a municipality. It's crazy. When you have this kind of exemption, you have to qualify it. So I'll just point out one more, Casa AZA Zoo. Well, there were cases that we've dealt with where Casa accreditation allowed Casa members to come into communities with their mobile live animal programs, their mobile zoos. And, you know, the exemption allowed them to do that. So there are quite a number of loopholes, and I think you've really got to look carefully and define what exactly that exemption means, because if you don't, you're going to open up a whole can of worms that you may not have anticipated. So here are some real life examples that I looked at that I pulled from bylaws last night. You can see in the second one, educational facilities, that was not defined. Any person in charge of a traveling circus, exhibition, or roadshow, or any employee thereof lawfully displaying animals. Another gaping loophole, the lawful operation of any circus, exhibition, menagerie, or carnival. Well, in many jurisdictions in Canada, including here in Ontario, there are no laws, there are no requirements, certainly provincially, that apply in terms of permitting or licensing. So they don't need anything, they already are lawful. Let's see what else. Persons carrying out educational programs. I think you get the idea that, you know, these create these massive loopholes. Jumping to some examples of lists that I wanted to point out some of the problems you see here, and this was actually on the second line there. This was a permitted list where they made a mistake of saying permitted animals mean, and they had a list, and then eventually they got to G and they said hedgehogs. Well, you've got to be very careful. What they mean are the four-toed hedgehog or the African pygmy hedgehog. They're the same thing. They're hybridized. They're common in the pet trade. I don't think they should be allowed at all. They're terrible pets. They're nocturnal, wide-ranging, insectivorous animals. But they're cute, and that's why they're kept as pets. Well, they've listed just hedgehogs. Well, there are 18 species. So this means that all 18 species are allowed. I don't think that was intentional. That was just lack of knowledge. So you've got to pay attention to this thing, these types of things. The first one, all large rodents, rodentia, including but not limited to. Well, I don't understand why they mean all large rodents, and they haven't defined what large rodents actually means. Now, rodents are the largest group of mammals that there is. The second largest are bats, but the first largest is rodents. So there are huge numbers of species out there, many of them exotic, many of them that are related to the transmission of zoonotic diseases. And you really have to define things. You can't make these kinds of mistakes without creating a potential for opening up the proverbial can of worms. And then the bottom two, I just put them in because I mentioned earlier, some of these things are funny. I thought this was kind of funny. In one bylaw, and only one out of the 99 we surveyed, they included tuataras. Now, most people have never even heard of a tuatara, and it's this obscure reptile that looks like a lizard but isn't a lizard. It's critically endangered. It lives on islands off the coast of New Zealand, and few people have ever even heard of it. So I don't know how this one made the list. And then there was another one where they had legless amphibians. They had no other amphibians and all the usual list. So sometimes I have to wonder, like, what's going on in the heads of people and how did they come up with these things? But you see a lot of sort of anomalous types of things like that, a lot of categories that are not inclusive enough, not explained, not defined. And that can be problematic because words do matter, especially in a court situation. Every word will be analyzed in a court situation. So moving forward, I just want to provide a few sort of ideas for guidance. Number one, include clear, concise definitions of all critical terms and phrases. I think that's absolutely important. And if you can't do it on your own, then contact World Animal Protection or Zoocheck or British Columbia SPCA or others that have the ability to either provide that information or to find it for you. Make sure your lists are technically accurate, and I just talked about that. Include the animal welfare principles and basic standards of housing and care. I've talked about that. I've talked about establishing positive list regulatory frameworks. Ensure that anyone keeping grandfathered animals, particularly dangerous species, are required to comply with comprehensive professional standards. I think we owe it to residents in the community. And certainly if anything happened, it would prevent or mitigate a lot of the headaches that may result. Ensure that exemptions, which I just talked about, are specific, clear, and do not provide exploitable opportunities for unanticipated activities. And like I said, this is something that we're seeing people exploit left, right, and center all over the province and in other provinces. I would advocate that mobile live animal programs, certainly with species that are on prohibited lists or species that are not on permitted lists or positive lists, shouldn't be allowed in municipalities. There are just too many problems for the animals, for human health and safety, and in other ways. And I think also that while pet stores generally are dealt with under separate licensing bylaws to one degree or another, that these animal welfare principles and basic standards of housing and care should definitely apply to pet stores and other types of commercial operations. I think if everybody did these types of things, then it would clean up a lot of bylaws. It would make things a little bit easier and would help as we move forward into the future. And finally, I would say that, and I always say this, apply the precautionary principle, especially when it comes to animals. And most of us know it, but the definition that I put up here, and I showed it in session 1, was if an action or policy might cause severe or irreversible harm. In the absence of scientific consensus, the burden of proof that harm will not result falls on those who would advocate taking the action. I think if we applied that in what I said previously, and if we applied the precautionary principle, we would not see big cats kept as pets in people's backyards. We would not see frogospheres that are put on people's desks or in windows where the frogs boil in the sun or freeze in the cold. You will not see Siamese fighting fish kept in small containers like that. You will not see reptile expos where they're abusing animals by not even providing them to opportunities to make normal postural adjustments. We wouldn't see animals like the big parrots that I described recently. I think there are a lot of good bylaws out there. There are a lot of good components to bylaws that really need some work. I don't think it's going to be exceptionally difficult in individual municipalities to look at things and to change them, to improve them. And I hope that some of what I said provides at least a few ideas. Like I said earlier, I think if you're already involved in policy development or enforcement, maybe you've thought about all these things before, maybe you're doing it now. But if you haven't, or if you're an activist that are looking at solving problems, think about some of the things I said. I think there's tremendous opportunities there. And my final word, well, I think, is that I think that as best we can, and it is a tall order, we should harmonize so that we've got everybody on the same page of the book. And we create a baseline that is acceptable from an animal welfare perspective, from a human health and safety perspective, from an enforcement perspective, and in every other way. So that's it on bylaws. And as you'll see, it really was a sexy and exciting topic to discuss. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Rob. That was really informative. I really appreciate that. So we have a couple of questions for you. The first one is from Chris Slick that says Vaughan has a new amended bylaw. You should have a look. Are you aware of the new bylaw in Vaughan?
I knew that there was changes being made. I have not had a chance to look at it. I looked at a bunch of others last night, but Vaughan was not included. But definitely, I will look at that. Certainly, I can say, based on my own experience, that the staff at Vaughan have been very receptive to looking at new information, new ideas. I think that's wonderful to see. And no, I'll after this session, I'll be looking at the Vaughan bylaw. And thank you for letting me know.
Great. All right, we have a question from Ariel Lynn-Vargas. So when you get to the Felidae, I think is how you pronounce it, with the exception of domestic cats on a banned species list, where do these new designer cats fall in, like the Savannahs, the Servals, and the Bengals? They're all the rage right now, and in the veterinary industry, we're pretty stressed as these cats pose a severe safety risk to the vet team and frankly, most of the time the owners, which, yeah, I could agree with that one. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of jurisdictions have already addressed hybrids. So they don't allow wolf dogs, for instance. They don't allow any of the hybridized cats. Many of the jurisdictions that I've encountered over the years have just said, we do not allow wild canids or hybrids of, the wording may vary from place to place. And again, I think, we need that harmonization of some of these terms, but you often see municipalities that are addressing that. Personally, I think municipalities should, I think provinces should either ban or not include these animals on prohibited lists. I think, the more laws that we have like that, the less the problem will be. And the argument has sometimes been put forward, well, the municipal bylaw is not going to change anything. It'll just move to the next municipality if that's not, under any type of control, or people will just do other things. Well, yes, but I think we have a responsibility to sort of chip away at the problem. And to me, it's sort of like chipping away at a big stone with a chisel. You take a little piece off, you take another piece off, eventually the whole thing's gone. So we have to look at this as a sort of a graduated way of dealing with the problem. And certainly we've saw this with circuses, working municipally across the country on circuses. And it's been the same experience in the UK and Australia and other places where, people said, well, if the circus is not allowed to come with its animals to my town, they're just going to go to the next town and continue on. Well, that's true. But if you get enough of these bylaws happening that hinder what the circus does, eventually the circus gives up. And that's exactly what Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus and others have done. And that's why we have virtually non-existent problem with wild animals in circuses here in Canada today. And we're seeing all kinds of other moves around the world. So I would say, with regard to the hybridized animals, yeah, let's just say, no, they're not allowed. And sure, we're going to face possible enforcement problems, and we may face technical and scientific problems trying to identify what's what, but it's a start. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us who care about animals to advocate for those kinds of measures.
Great. Okay, I'm just gonna ask one more question and then we do need to move on. But I just wanted to say to Roxanne Garland, I'm gonna leave your question up because I think that either Michelle might be answering this question in her presentation, and if not, she can certainly answer that question after her. So we'll leave your question up. But there was an anonymous question. You listed the Zoological Society Association of America, the ZAA, as an accrediting body, despite the fact that it's known to accredit substandard facilities and those allowing contact between people and wild animals, whether it's zookeepers keepers doing shows or animal interactions with the public.
Yep.
And in fact, in the US, MLAPs and other exhibitors are using ZAA accreditation to legitimize themselves and to organize against legislation that would affect them. Do you think that the ZAA accreditation is valid or comparable to the GFAS or the AZA?
No, absolutely not. I do not think the ZAA standards are very good. I simply mentioned it as one of the potential accrediting bodies in the United States. And if you look at their standards, if you're looking, let's say you've got some type of dangerous animal, if you look at their standards, and we've actually done this, there are components of what they say that are not bad, that basically corroborate what the other organizations have done. There are components of their standards that I think are terrible. So I wouldn't endorse their standards. I would simply say that they're yet another standard that's out there, that if you're in a municipality and you're looking for backing material that will support what you're doing, you might want to look at some of what they're doing. But yeah, the American Zoo and Aquarium Association standard is much better. The Global Federation of Animal Sanctuary standard is much better. The Taxon Advisory Group standards and some of the stud books have standards. There are individual institutional standards for some species. You know, they tend to be better. But what I do when I'm looking for my support material is I won't throw anything aside. I'll look at it all and say what helps me do what I want to do. So I think the ZAA standards could be a tool, but I wouldn't in no way, shape, or form endorse them.
Great, thanks, Rob. So you have a couple more questions, one from Anne-Marie and another anonymous one. Maybe you could type the answers to those questions for them so we get them answered. I really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So moving on to our next speaker is Michele Hamers. Michele has a BSc in Animal Husbandry and Welfare and an MSc in Animal Biology and Welfare, and is a member of the Royal Society of Biology and designated European professional biologist. She's been working in animal welfare for the last almost decade and is an expert on captive wildlife issues. During the last 5 years, she has been focusing specifically on reptile behavior and welfare. And as World Animal Protection's Wildlife Campaign Manager and one of my colleagues, she's responsible for the exotic pet welfare work here in Canada and oversees the organization's Wildlife Not Pets campaign. Her main goal is to increase visibility and spread awareness around about exotic pets here in Canada. So Michele, I'm just gonna turn over control to you. Just give me a second here. Oh shoot, hey, just give me one sec.
I have my presentation ready, so I can also share my screen if you like.
No, I think it'll be fine.
Okay.
I just clicked something.
So as Cassandra mentioned, I'll be speaking on the positive list regulations, and you already heard a bunch of it from Rob, so luckily I can skip some of my slides about the information he already mentioned. I'll be talking a little bit about why we should regulate exotic animals, going into a negative list, giving you some more examples, but again, I think Rob did an excellent job explaining this, so that will help quicken this presentation. And then I'll go into positive list regulations. I'll have examples of positive lists here in Canada and across the world, and go into especially trying to emphasize why criteria and positive lists are so critically important in order to have them properly enforced and properly enshrined in the laws. So just waiting until Cass pulls up the presentation and then we're ready to go. Okay,
I have it now.
Great.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Okay, so as I mentioned today, I will be talking about positive regulations of exotic animals. With the subtitle, it's all about criteria, and I will emphasize this throughout my talk today, because without criteria, no matter how in spirit, how good a positive list is, it means very little and can be actually as poor as a negative list. So reasons to regulate exotic pets, a refresher, we can go over this very quickly for you who have seen my presentation in the first week. Animal welfare, obviously as animal welfare organization, we are quite concerned with keeping of exotic pets. They're not domesticated, they haven't evolved with us. They don't belong in our homes. This is a picture that was taken in 2019 in a home in Ontario. Second, public health and safety. Again, as Rob mentioned, there are a lot of zoonotic diseases that can be carried by exotic pets, not only birds and reptiles, but also mammals. And on the right, you see a picture of a roadside zoo, a collector of exotic animals who opened a roadside zoo last year, which is currently closed again, and was allowing people to interact with lion cubs, but also full-grown lions and tigers, which is extremely dangerous. So these are things to consider. Wildlife populations and habitats. We see an increasing number of animals that are becoming invasive. Research was conducted in Ontario and in like the Great Lakes. And it turned out that a number of species had already established itself. Of the 40 species that did, 5 of them are thought to be coming from the pet trade. And they also find species that haven't established themselves in, as a population, so they haven't become invasive yet, but they have been found in our Great Lakes. So for example, piranhas from South America and the red-tailed catfish. And all of them were thought to be released from the exotic pet trade. Problematic prohibited lists. So as Rob mentioned, most of the a lot of regulations are currently prohibiting animals that are dangerous or thought to be dangerous. And I'll go quickly over why prohibited lists, in our opinion, don't work. We see a lot of them throughout. Rob talked about a lot about municipalities, and I'll be focusing more on the provincial situation. So these are examples of prohibited lists in British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Alberta. In total, 8 provinces and territories have prohibited lists. BC has by far the most elaborate one, and it covers over 1,291 species. And when looking, for example, in Ontario, because Ontario doesn't regulate the keeping of exotic animals provincially, about half of municipalities have a negative list. And there's a majority of municipalities that don't have any regulations currently. So why we consider prohibited list, and I'll fly through this because Rob already mentioned a lot of things. They historically developed to protect people from harm. They're not covering a lot of species like reptiles and birds and fishes. They must be very rigorous to prevent unintentional consequences. So as BC tried with listing over 1,000 species, they still found that after the introduction of the prohibited list, new animals that they did not consider during the process of developing the prohibited list came into the province. I believe it was about the Patagonian mara that all of a sudden became a pet for people because it wasn't listed. And then, as to Rob's point, it makes it very difficult for animal welfare organizations or governments to create a case to actually add this animal to the list. Also, enforcement feasibility. And the main thing I'd like to point out here is that maybe we think we can recognize a lot of animals like elephants and lions and tigers, but when it comes to the number of species that are out there, it's actually really difficult to to differentiate animals. The picture that you see here are two different snakes, and you might think on the picture they look very different, but you can imagine in a domestic environment and you encounter a snake, one highly venomous and the other one completely non-venomous. Are you able to make a decision, and are you able to know which one's which? So again, to drive this point home, these are a bunch of chameleons from the same family. Some of them are highly endangered and subject to like CITES and harvesting quotas, whereas others are not listed at all and are not considered to be endangered. There was actually a study done by Alfino and Roberts in 2019 where they tested enforcement officers to recognize how well they could recognize the different species that were presented in front of them. And the test results varied greatly from 0% accuracy to 95% accuracy. So you can see even like highly trained individuals can very much struggle in identifying these animals. A little bit more, why do we reconsider prohibited list? I think we have to take a step back and also remember that we are part of a wider trade, right? It's not only about what happens here in Toronto or somewhere in Vancouver, but these animals that are being imported, they're not home to Canada. And it affects the biodiversity in other places. So in total, many studies have been done, and I'm just citing one of them, is that more than 31,000 terrestrial bird mammals, amphibians, and reptile species are globally traded. And it's thought that because of trade similarities among species that are currently not in a trade, that more than 4,000 species are at risk to enter the trade eventually. So these lookalike species that, you know, they might become extinct or they might be harder to find and therefore be replaced by species that are currently not in the trade. The exotic pet trade is ever developing and new species are being discovered. And it has come to a point that scientists are refusing to announce where they found a new species because they are afraid that they're being exploited by the pet industry. As well, the introduction of zoonotic diseases. Paris imported from Asia spread Newcastle disease, for example, to poultry and wild birds in Europe. Gambian giant rat spread monkeypox in the United States. And we have the chytrid fungus in frogs and salamanders that caused a decline in salamander and other amphibian populations worldwide. And all this is thought to be caused by the exotic pet industry, or at least the exotic pet industry being a driver of this trade. So there's a big disconnect, because if we look how animals are regulated, Rob mentioned it's mostly about safety, but is this really true? If we look at physical safety, perhaps, like lions and tigers that can actually, you know, kill us. But when we're looking at smaller animals, there is still a huge safety issue. And 2 years ago, we did a similar workshop training, and the speaker at that time, Clifford Warwick, he came up with this example, and I thought it was brilliant. If we're looking at other products around us, everything has been tested and has to meet criteria in order for us to use it. A chair, a car, it doesn't matter, right? They go through a rigorous process to make sure it's safe to be consumed and used by us. But when we're looking at exotic pets, this is absolutely not the case, right? We allow animals that have sharp edges, that can scratch and bite, that cannot be cleaned or sanitized. So they're almost certainly infectious. And they're living animals, so they experience as well harm or can be damaged if not being treated carefully, right? But we don't have any labeling for these animals. And I think that's something to think about. Because again, when we look around us, everything around us is based on a positive list, really. And we need to move into that direction when talking about animals. So positive list, a science-driven solution. Again, I think I can go over this quite quickly because Rob mentioned many of it. Animal species that can be kept by private citizens in a jurisdiction are listed in the regulation. And a positive list could also apply, for example, to regulating circuses or businesses that have animals. So, you know, you can have regular positive lists that apply to pet stores, for example. The purpose of positive lists is a precautionary approach. It is there to safeguard animal welfare, the environment, human health and safety, addresses nuisance issues, and it's an easier way to enforce the keeping of exotic animals within a jurisdiction. So many advantages, as already mentioned. It's preventative in nature, and I think that's a big one, especially if we see how current regulations are often behind on the exotic pet trade, that we're often something needs to materialize, something terrible needs to materialize in order for us to take action. And I think we're, even if we're looking at the pandemic today, and which is caused by the wildlife trade, I think eventually I hope we'll be learning that we need to take steps ahead of time in order to prevent issues from occurring. It's an evidence-based approach. I'm not saying the negative list cannot be evidence-based, but I think because historically negative lists have been focusing on physical danger, that there's less thought given to other criteria that must be incorporated. It's easy to understand. I mean, there's a list of animals, and if the animal's on there, you can keep it, and if not, it's prohibited. It's probably also easier to train enforcement officers to recognize the animals that are actually allowed versus trying to recognize animals that are banned. And there's a growing popularity in jurisdictions throughout the world, and I'll touch upon that later in my presentation. However, and this is something that I think is really important, and whenever we talk to provincial government officials or municipality bylaw officers or people responsible for developing these regulations, the positive is only advantageous if the development and implementation follow the foundational principles and are enshrined in the law, right? So a predetermined list of criteria must be established. So the regulation or the act must set out criteria that need to be taken into consideration when developing these lists. Without that, the list will remain as arbitrary as the prohibited lists are. Science should be primary consideration, and precautionary principles should be applied. And it's all about criteria. So there are many criteria you can consider. And as Rob mentioned, they might slightly vary among jurisdictions based on your capacity, your resources, the knowledge that you have. But in general, I think the main 3 points that the 3 main criteria that are reoccurring wherever you look at positive lists are animal welfare, public health and safety, and environmental protection. And the environmental protection can be split up in 2 directions. One, to protect our environment from invasive species and the introduction of novel diseases, and protecting wildlife and the environment elsewhere by, making sure that animals that are endangered cannot be kept, for example, as pets, and to ensure that if you would decide as a jurisdiction to allow certain exotic animals to be kept, that they're coming from self-sustaining captive populations, so that there is no need for animals to continue to be captured from the wild, being imported into Canada. And this is a very important point, because I think many people might, at least what we hear from the exotic pet industry is often like, they're all bred in captivity. But a very good example is that an investigation that we've done into the ball python trade, Canada still imports wild-caught ball pythons for the trade. So even though we look around us and it looks like all these animals are captive bred, there is still a wild-caught supply going on, and that needs to be addressed and considered. The other considerations, I think disposition of animals is a big one. I think it's often forgotten that shelters are usually not equipped to take care of exotic animals, especially when it comes to animals that don't thrive in the climate that we live in. So animals that require a tank or like a room that is climate controlled, like reptiles, certain birds and amphibians. And I think if there is no capacity for it, then these animals should not be kept as pets. There needs to be a plan B. Another issue is that rehoming is incredibly difficult when it comes to exotic pets because there's only a small percentage of the population that is interested in keeping these animals. And to be fair with you, there aren't really options when it comes to sanctuaries where animals can be placed in to live out their lives. So what often happens is that either the animals end up with breeders and they might be used again for breeding purposes and therefore like continuing the cycle of the exotic pet trade. Also, some of these animals end up in certain zoos or reptile zoos that will use the animals in mobile live animal programs. So instead of living out their lives in comfort, they are still exposed to traveling and to having to be around people and such. So the disposition of animals, I think, should be a consideration for most jurisdictions. In the same line, the availability of knowledge, vets and other resources must be available. And again, the precautionary principles should be applied. And then when there's doubt, the benefit of the animal, the benefit of doubt goes to the species. And the beauty of the positive list is that it's much more fluid because once research and science develops and more information comes out. So, you know, if science at one point in time might say like, hey, we, as in some sort of way, we can keep this animal in a very safe, stable, healthy, good way, then that can be provided, that information can be provided to the government and they can make a decision based on that information. But I think Rob made a very valid point by saying that at least the onus is on the shoulders of people that want to trade and exploit these animals versus the people that try to regulate and take into consideration what the community wants and needs. So back to animal welfare, because I think that's a very important one as well. And I think this is the, when talking to people in municipalities and provinces, I think this is the criteria where people scratch their heads and like, how are we even going to do this? Like, there are so many animals, where do we start? We don't know what we're doing. And I understand that. It's it can be a very elaborate process, but there are some tools and a couple of guidelines that you can follow to make it a little bit more easy, the process a little bit more easy. That being said, the process in itself requires time, effort, and resources, right? Like any other process. And I would encourage municipalities and other jurisdictions to take the time and do it well. Because once, as Rob said, once we have a couple of positive lists that are done really well and with the criteria implemented, others can copy and paste it, and then it will be easier to implement. So a couple of things to take into consideration when thinking about animals living in our homes. First of all, the lifespan. Turtles and tortoises often live up to 50, 100 years. The same for parrots. Lots of snakes that have lifespan expectations longer than 20 years. And these animals do not make good pets because we as humans are not very good in thinking in long-term thoughts. So, you know, if you have a parrot at home, you probably have to put it in your will, or a turtle, or that needs to happen. So in order to help people to prevent them from making these kind of purchasing mistakes by ending up with an animal that lives way longer than they might thought of, I think lifespan should be a big consideration in establishing regulations. The body size, I think that makes sense. I mean, you can't keep a tiger in an apartment or a snake that grows over 3 meters in a house, because the space that you need in order for the animal to engage in normal behaviors, it's too big. It's one of the criteria that was really used in the establishment of the positive list in Belgium, where they looked at like, okay, what does a normal house look like? How much space is there? And is it reasonable enough for an animal to live in that space and to occupy that space together with their owners? The activity budget or the activity schedule of an animal. We see many animals in the exotic pet trade, like sugar gliders, for example, that are nocturnal. Some animals that usually get active during dusk and dawn. And we have to ask ourselves, does it make sense to have these animals as pets? Because most people have daytime jobs, or they are awake during the day, they sleep at night. And these animals have the opposite schedule, which means that if we want to interact, we want to observe these animals, they usually have to be disturbed in their rest and sleep cycles, which can be very detrimental to their health and their welfare. So activity budgets are quite important as well when thinking about which animals should and should not be kept. As well, wide-ranging and migratory behaviors. So animals like a lot of tortoises who can, have acres of territory that they would roam through. Lots of snakes as well, and lizards, which might surprise you that studies find in the wild that they have territories up to 5-10 hectares, which is quite large, and a little tank could never replace that. Or for example, birds, right? A lot of birds are migratory, a lot of birds fly kilometers in a day, and no captive environment can replace that. Other things to take into consideration as well, and this kind of encaptures already what I spoke about, is that there needs to be an ability to express a normal range of key natural behaviors. And as well, one doesn't exclude the other. The manifestation of abnormal behaviors must be absent or rare. Those two are independent from each other and should be judged as such. As well, and this has also to do with key natural behaviors like climate must be, you have to be able to replicate the natural environment, the furnishment, enrichment, etc. And in many cases, you will see when you apply these criteria very consistent that these animals simply don't meet it, right? But like the weather, we can't replicate the weather in a little tank. It's impossible. So in one, like, I think when you really think about it, it's a very easy step, an easy leap to make, to say like these animals, we just can't take care of them and they should be kept they should be left in the wild, or perhaps, as a rescued animal in a zoological institution or something, but they don't belong in our households. So one of the many tools have been actually developed to try to measure animal welfare and animal suitability to be a pet. Many of these systems, unfortunately, are highly scientific and very complex, and to be honest, quite a boring read and complicated read. But luckily, there's a group of 18 scientists, veterinarians, and vet technicians that developed this EMO tool. And there's a website that we can provide you with, where you can go to and you can actually type in the species that you're looking for, and it will provide you with a score. So they did a range of animals that they already scored, but if the animal isn't part of it, they will take you through the steps how to score that animal. And it's very simple. It's based on 4 principles. It's based on biology and behavior of animal species and types. It's based on the welfare needs according to the 5 freedoms. It's based on the degree to which impartial and qualified husbandry guidance is available, and the potential public health and safety risks. I think, especially since animal welfare is such it's a very big project to measure it, I think this is the right tool to start with, and I would recommend it to everybody. So moving on, now we know which criteria to consider and what to look for when we're going into developing a positive list. How could the process look like when developing a positive list? And this is based on positive lists that have already been developed and implemented in Europe, since they seem to be the first to really establish the criteria and really enshrine in the law what it means to have a positive list. So first of all, again, determine and define criteria. This needs to happen in order to have an open and fair process to show animal welfare groups as well as the exotic pet trade, like this is the criteria that are important to our jurisdiction. You have to meet them. And if you don't meet them, the animal is not on the list. do we have an animal that's not listed yet? You come with the evidence that shows that the animal actually meets all the criteria. This is really, really important because again, if we don't enshrine these criteria and we don't explain them, we don't define them, these lists become as arbitrary as prohibited lists. And that's something we want to move away from. We want to be better than the systems that we already have in place. Analyzing presence of exotic pets in the community. So this is to determine which animals you want to subject to these criteria, because it's impossible to look at the 10,000 bird species, 11,000 reptile species and go by them one by one. That's understandable, but you don't have to. So the advice is to go to pet stores and breeders, perhaps a public survey, and look which animals are currently in your community. So that's one way that should be the basis of that should be the starting point of which animals should be tested or should be subject to these criteria. And then it was a very interesting point that the colleague in Europe mentioned, is that let's say you have a negative list and you think this positive list system makes sense and you would like to move towards that, but you don't know how and you don't want to remove, take away the whole bylaw and implement a new one. It is possible, as Rob said, to implement a positive list within a negative list. But also, if you already have a negative list, that in itself is not a burden for establishing a positive list, because the existence of a negative list might actually be helpful because you know all the animals that you don't want in your community and therefore are automatically left off that list, right? So it already excludes the species for risk assessment for the positive list. So this can even be when looking, for example, at federal legislations, and there are like negative lists for like migratory birds or for like species at risk, like all these animals that are already listed and prohibited to be exploited, those animals automatically don't have to be assessed because you don't want them in your communities anyways. So these are a couple of ways to look at where to start when looking at developing a positive list. And then the next step is the actual review process, which is, I think, the most daunting for most people. As I said, there is an EMO tool out there that measures the ease, if it's easy, moderate, difficult, or extreme to keep an animal as a pet. But you can also look at more international guidelines. For example, if animals are classified as endangered by the IUCN or CITES, these animals could be considered as inappropriate and should be automatically left off the list. And then maybe not necessarily feasible for municipalities, but for provinces, you can always, establish an advisory group of experts and professionals and the pet industry and animal welfare organizations, and create a round table and talk about these issues and have them provide the evidence why an animal should or should not be listed. Then a little bit about the phrasing, because we've seen some interesting things out there. There are different ways to enshrine the positive list. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. To enshrine the positive list in the bylaw or regulation. These are some examples. And I think the interesting one is to have a positive list within a negative list, because some acts might not necessarily enshrine the principle of a positive list. But as you can see in this example, how it was written in this bylaw, like no person shall keep, own, harbor, possess any prohibited animal. And then they created a table that says prohibited all except for. Well, that's a positive list within a negative list. And I think that's an excellent system also because most jurisdictions already have negative lists. So why start all over again if you can just build on what you already have? The next step is the implementation. And there are a couple of things that need to be considered and learnings that other countries had about the implementation process. that I would like to share with you. First of all, public education and public communication about the changes in the law are critically important. So an announcement of the change in regulation, education materials that would support this, especially when looking at exotic pets. Pet stores, shelters can be an excellent way to communicate change in legislation and to make sure that people are aware which animals are becoming illegal or are legal. So that's a big one. Grandfathering clause, as Rob mentioned, so I won't spend too much time on it. There are different ways to implement grandfathering clause. They can incorporate certain animal welfare standards or animal care standards. Sometimes registration is mandatory. We don't really think voluntary registration is necessarily efficient because it's voluntary, and sometimes you don't know what people have behind the door. So it's almost could be not the best use of your resources. But like grandfathering clauses, what they should include is some description about possession, like is the person that has an animal that is now illegal to be kept but is grandfathered in, can it be sold? Can you breed with it? Like what happens with this animal during its life? And these things needs to be clarified in the grandfathering clause. All right, so now some examples of positive lists in Canada and around the world. But first, again, remember, it's very important to look at the existing positive list in a highly critical way, because within Canada, I don't think there are positive lists that meet all the basic criteria that we set. So animal welfare, public health and safety, and environmental safety. So it's very important that even when looking at other bylaws, not to just blindly copy and pasting them necessarily, but to have a critical look at them and see what criteria are important to your jurisdiction and use them. You can always get ideas from other bylaws and acts and regulations, but in Canada, the positive list is quite new still. I think the criteria attached to the positive list, that idea is quite new. So even though there are lists out there that are in principle positive lists, they don't actually have the spirit of the positive list with all the criteria and the scientific background, etc. So again, remember that criteria need to be enshrined in the regulations or in the act to make sure that animals are actually measured and scored accordingly. And that's the only way to have an open and fair process. All right, so moving on to positive lists in Canada. So we have a few, and we did quite some research, Zoocheck as well as World Animal Protection. We did quite some research on this. So 3 provinces have positive lists: New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan, and 3 provinces, territories have a hybrid system, including Nova Scotia, Nunavut, and Alberta. So I'd like to give you examples of how they enshrine things in the law and how they have approached the development or the text that they're using to regulate the positive list or to regulate the process around it. So in New Brunswick, the new Exotic Animals Act that came into force after the tragic incident of the 2 little young boys that were killed due to an African rock python. So they have now an act that's only focused on exotic animals. And the act says that the purpose is to protect public, native flora and fauna, and to regulate ownership and possession of exotic animals in consideration of their conservation status and complex life needs. And this is very interesting because I do think we see a trend. We see more and more that acts that are supposed to regulate the welfare of animals, that they actually mandate to look at the complexity of animals and to consider that they're lively beings with emotions and needs and wants and a desire for a good and healthy life. So this is definitely a very interesting case. Unfortunately, the regulations under this act haven't been developed yet. At least there's a committee that has been established that is looking into this and that are currently reviewing the old positive list that already exists. Moving on to Alberta, which is interesting because where in most places you're not allowed to keep native wildlife, Alberta has actually a positive list that allows people to keep native wildlife. So the regulations state a person may possess any live, non-licensed animal, except a raccoon, a skunk, or a bat, of a kind that is wildlife animal. So non-licensed animal are native wildlife that can be legally kept as pets without permit. Then we have Newfoundland, which has a type, and it just shows how positive lists can be used. As I said, within a municipality, you can apply it to businesses as well to pet owners. But at a provincial level, you can do the same thing. So for example, in Newfoundland, they focus on the importation actually. So they say like a person shall not import any wild animal except for animals listed in Schedule B in this case. But no criteria mentioned though. So it's quite an arbitrary list of animals that cannot be imported. But again, it's a type of positive list or a way to approach it in a way that animals that are on the list are legal, everything else illegal. Nova Scotia has the positive list is not enshrined in their law, but it's policy, which I mean, it works at the moment, but of course it would be for us, it would be more secure if it's within an act or a regulation that actually determines which animals can and cannot be kept rather than a department policy. A couple of other ones. Nunavut is similar to Newfoundland. They're looking at the importation of animals. So animals cannot be imported unless listed somewhere. Prince Edward Island actually has a positive list for circuses. And I think this is one of the better ones that exist within Canada. And the positive list goes hand in hand with a set of very stringent animal welfare, animal care criteria. So this is actually quite a good act, and it really discouraged any circus from coming or going to Prince Edward Island. And then we have Saskatchewan that has a positive list for native and non-native species. When looking at municipalities, Rob mentioned there are several of them in Ontario and several of them in Quebec. But again, if we look at like if there are any criteria on which these lists are based, usually we don't see any. So that means that they're pretty much as arbitrary as prohibited lists. About interesting things that we see in bylaws. For example, there's some municipalities in Quebec that have a double negative in how they describe which animals can or cannot be kept. So for example, it is prohibited for anyone to keep captive for any purpose whatsoever, an animal not belonging to one of the following categories. So it's a little bit of a brain teaser. I had to think about it myself a couple of times, but it's a double negative list, so it turns out to be a positive after all. These are the examples in Canada that we know of, and maybe there are more that we're just not aware of at a municipal level at least. Elsewhere in the world, as I said, Europe is kind of the driver for the positive list. Belgium was the first country actually that we know of globally that implemented a positive list for mammals at a federal level. And they used 5 criteria, again, animal welfare. And they simply said animals must be easy to keep and able to be kept according to their physical, ethological, and ecological needs. And what it came down to is that they looked at, can an animal be kept by anyone who does not have any experience in the caretaking of this animal. And they had a very practical approach to the implementation of the positive list. And I think that's why it sort of worked for Belgium. Other criteria were the environment, human health, the availability of information, and the precautionary principle. So these 5 criteria, that's the basis, actually, that's the foundation of the positive list as we advocate for. Then we have the Netherlands, which is a whole different presentation in itself, but the framework of the positive list is enshrined in the law. So it's mandated, but there are still no regulations because they are still trying to figure out what an objective methodology is to assess animals. And I think once they come to an agreement on a methodology, it will be very easy for other jurisdictions to implement them because the Dutch government is actually planning on releasing all of the information online, all the assessments and the methodology itself. So once this framework is, or the methodology is agreed upon, it will make it a lot easier for many jurisdictions to copy the work. UK had a positive list that I recently became aware of for fishes, actually, for the pet fish trade industry. Looking to our southern neighbors in the US, there are a couple of states that have positive lists. I looked into Maine, and they have a hybrid system like many other jurisdictions. So they have a list that is prohibits certain animals, a list that restricts certain animals, and a list that allows certain animals. Restricted lists are usually tied in with animal care provisions or licensing schemes or something with that. And their criteria were mostly in the interest of wildlife, their own wildlife, the public and local natural resources. Looking at Australia, I find Australia very interesting because whereas in most places, at least in Canada, you're not allowed to keep native wildlife, but we're okay to keep the wildlife from another place. Australia is the opposite. They don't allow any exotic animals to come into the country. So the wildlife that is allowed to be kept as pets are native wildlife. And then, for example, New South Wales has a positive list system where 41 species are exempt of any permits. Their permit systems are actually pretty rigorous. And for example, animals can only be acquired from licensed pet shop or licensed animal keeper. So any animal has some sort of certificate and can be followed and tracked throughout its life in captivity. Final one that we know of is Singapore. Well, we know of many more, but the final one I'd like to highlight. And this is because this is a positive list that was established to protect the local environment for the spread of novel diseases and invasiveness and the introduction of invasive species. But even though the positive list there is quite small, even if the positive list there allows for quite some animals, there are conditions that must be met in order to keep the animals that are listed on the positive list. So that's another way to approach it. So the conditions that must be met include they must be in possession of appropriate permits. Animals cannot be bred, re-exported, or used for display or sold. So it's very much like you own a pet, and for the rest of it, for his or her lifetime, and that's it. And owners must comply with the Code of Animal Welfare, which has animal welfare and care provisions in it. So lots of ways to look at it, and I just want to say there's no one size fits all, and you might per jurisdiction have some different criteria, but I think I hope the message to give you today is that if you go into the direction of a positive list, which we hope we do, it's really important to establish criteria within your regulations to ensure to make it a fair and open process and to make sure that these animals are actually going through a process in order to determine if they are suitable to be kept as pets. So in a little, I saw some questions coming up about documentation or information that we have. So we're actually working on some documents right now that will provide you with a brief overview of like positive list, negative list, how to implement them, what to look for, value review processes, checklists, and more. And there will also be a scientific article will be coming out hopefully by the end of this year, which I'm co-authoring about, and it's an analysis about the exotic or about positive lists and why they are beneficial. And it will give you a better idea which other jurisdictions have implemented it. And I believe that's the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned some tools. And if there are any questions at any point in time, feel free to reach out. I don't know if Cass can take it from here.
Yep, I can.
Great.
Sorry, yeah, start my video again. Thanks for that, Michelle. That was really, really interesting. The question that we have in front of us that came up during Rob's presentation was, could you please share examples of positive list regulation bylaws? I think that you did that in your presentation, but did you want to just quickly touch on that again, or?
Yeah, so I actually, besides the article that's coming out this year that will have a list of Canadian provinces and municipalities that have positive list, I have an overview as well. So you can reach out to me by email and I'm happy to send you more information on that.
Great. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions for you,
Okay.
which is great. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick break. It's my clock is showing 3 minutes after 2. If we could be back at 2:10, we could try to be back at 2:10. So hopefully that gives you time to stretch your legs just a little bit, and then we'll get started on our next speaker. Okay, we'll let people get settled in and we'll get started on the second half of our afternoon. Thanks for coming back in so promptly. I'm going to assume you're all back promptly. Our next speaker of the afternoon is Captain Cindy Machado. Captain Machado is a certified animal welfare administrator. After completing her formal education and specializing in animal services, Cindy began her career as an animal services officer with the Marin Humane over 36 years ago. So she's in charge of administering the animal services contract for Marin County and all of its cities, as well as supervising the activities of the Animal Services Division at the Marin Humane. She coordinates and supervises the basic and advanced animal law enforcement academies held at Marin Humane, and Captain Machado has a strong interest and expertise with issues facing livestock and poultry, captive and native wildlife, animal cruelty, and animal disaster planning, which fits along the lines of what we do here at World Animal Protection. She's often utilized as an expert to assist other agencies in the enforcement of animal cruelty cases, as well as speaking about the important animal issues. She's currently on the advisory board for Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance and is a current member of CAL Animals, the Association for Animal Welfare and Advancement, the International Veterinary Forensic Science Association, and the National Alliance for State Animal and Agricultural Emergency Programs. And in her free time, Cindy enjoys sharing her life with numerous fur, dogs and kitties, and feathered chickens and peafowls, rescued animals, family members. So thank you very much, Cindy. We look forward to your talk. And I'm just gonna turn my camera and mic off and then turn the remote over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cass. And thank you so much for all of you joining us. This is an exciting series. I've very much enjoyed it. And I'm a longtime admirer of Zoocheck and World Animal Protection. So thank you for putting this together. Just a little bit of geography. I'm just north of the San Francisco Bay Area in California, and it's a lovely place. People are very gracious about animals, very sensitive to their needs. And for the last 36 years that I've been with Marin Humane, we've seen amazing stewardship of animals, the landscape, regulations, and it's kind of been a model for many places throughout America. And so with that, I just wanted to let you know that I'm really glad to be here with you today instead of dealing with pandemics and wildfires and emergency power shutoffs, and probably most importantly, a break from the politics at bay. So with that, let's get started and let's see if, okay. Cass, I may need your help. The slide is not advanced. Okay, there we go. I wanted to just give you a brief introduction. As I mentioned, we're in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco, and it's a very great combination of both urban landscapes and wild landscapes. And our animal services officers respond to probably 80% of native wildlife issues. And I always think of our wild animals as the neighbors that educate our community members. Sometimes it's very challenging. Definitely baby fawns win the prize for the most wanted and welcomed. And we do a lot of education of our community members on not to touch them, leave them alone. And this is the holiday season approaching. So the little screech owl you see in the photo in the below is one more example of an educational opportunity where she was actually caught up in Halloween decorations. And that photo continues to make its way across many different journal outlets. And the message that we've been able to garnish with that one screech owl is really be cautious when you put decorations up. The buck that you see in the upper corner, he's actually entangled with Christmas holiday lights all throughout his antlers. We know that they shed their antlers, so it wasn't a huge safety issue, but yet it garnered so much publicity from neighbors, people concerned about his welfare, neighbors being willing to track him for us. And I think, as I've been there 36 years now, resonates how when you give people an animal story, they really do look to these animals as educators, simply just by their presence. And Marin Humane, we advocate for all animals, from horses to wildlife, domestics, obviously. But we have a long history of being an advocacy-led organization and have some really progressive stances and positions. The little guinea pig is one of our very favorite staff members. We include small companion animals as equals to our dogs and cats. And I thought that was a festive greeting for us to start today. So we talk about animal ambassadors. There's a lot of words that come into play, a lot of confusion around what they are. And as Rob mentioned earlier this morning, and I'm a big believer of this too, words really do matter. And so when we're looking at animals on display, more specifically, how we frame ambassador animals, so to speak, especially exotic animals, these are all some of the words that will pop up. And I think lately the big one that I see quite a bit of is around conservation. What does really conservation mean from an animal ambassador perspective? But not only that, they're really capturing the momentum by integrating schools, families, libraries, all these venues that are really looked upon as educational opportunities to plug in these ambassador animals. So we're going to take a look at a lot of the different venues, some of the philosophies, some of the ethics. It seems, at least in America, to be a growing trend, and we've got some legislation that I'll share with you that's been pretty exciting to see. But just in the framework, be aware of some of these words that we see with these venues. So I think when we look at the word ambassador, I, for one, really had to kind of take a second look at, what does this word mean? Is it just a marketing term that animal venues are really engaging in? Is there methodology in the use of this word? And so I did a little bit of homework, and a couple of the definitions that resonated with me, the first one being an authorized representative or messenger. Now, when we look at how animals are plugged into being authorized representatives or messengers, to me, at least, it's very obvious they're not signing up. And so people, humans, us, are being their representative and messengers on their behalf, which makes that kind of an interesting concept. The other meaning that I came across that I really actually thought is a true meaning is an unofficial representative traveling abroad as ambassadors of goodwill. Now, this really has some parallel meaning with all of the non-native animals that we see that end up in this role as ambassador, from far countries, far, far away, from jungles and habitats that we'd only dream of being able to visit. So maybe for those species, this truly gives them a deeper meaning of an ambassador. How it's goodwill to rip them out of their environment for our entertainment or education, that's probably a second series of discussions. When I look at who really is a true ambassador, the first person that resonates with me is my hero, Jane Goodall. And I think her work over the many, many decades is really instrumental on exactly what ambassadorship is. And in her case, we were fortunate to see her being appointed as the messenger of peace, which has a huge role across the world. We have a very active Roots and Shoots club within our humane education, and we follow her work. I read her books. I keep up on any opportunity to ever hear her speak. I will be the first to be there. But when we look at her messaging as an ambassador, what we see not only around global peace, but this whole concept of humans being put in a position where we really have to stop destroying the natural world. I think that is the true essence of a lot of these exotic animal issues. When we're taking them out of their natural environments in their world, shipping them across continents to our world, to our containers, to our reptile expos, to our, captive held places, we're probably not doing the world a bit of good service by doing so. So one might ask, how did animals become ambassadors? And that's the interesting concept that I'm not sure I have the answer for you per se. But what we do see is this methodology around education. You'll hear the word experience, where people have to experience an animal, and then kind of vaguely imprinted in all of those is the message. And that message is really where it becomes critical to look at. What are we trying to promote? How are we trying to promote it? And what are we promoting it with? Now, these are wonderful, beautiful faces, just a fraction of the many animals, including one kitty at the top, that are considered animal ambassadors on behalf of Marin Humane. And yes, we use that word too in the domestic world. And so I would ask you, do you think these animals signed up on their own to be in this role, this unique role of ambassadors in our community? No, not one of them did, but all of their guardians did. And so for that, it kind of plays a look at, you know, who's trying to do what here. And so in this case with us, we use animal ambassadors in a variety of ways. And I think it's fair to say we use it to get a message across, we use it to have an experience, and we use them to educate. And while their faces are also cute, what's equally important are, you know, the faces that get to be touched by them. Everything from visiting senior centers to events. We even have a welcoming group of ambassador, usually dogs, at our gala and our events, to some of the more intense jobs, which include going into schools after a tragedy and using our dogs and volunteers to offer therapeutic solitude and just being able to look at a dog and pet a dog. We also have specially trained dogs that help kids read. Dogs are really actually trained to look at the kid. The kid is looking at the dog to read them a book. And so there are all these magical ways of instilling great experiences with animals. But again, it's not the animals. And some animals really do enjoy this, we found, but some don't. And so it's up to us to determine what is the right role for these animals. And more importantly, it comes back to the person behind that animal. Let's take a look at wild animals as ambassadors. And when I say wild animals, you know, I'll use the full definition of exotic animals, native wildlife, non-native wildlife. How did they come into play as ambassadors? And what's very similar with regard to domestic animals is this whole concept of the education, the experience, and the message. And what they're really embroiled in at the bottom is conservation. And that's where things go a little bit off kilter when we look at the role of wild animals as ambassadors and how they fit into this this role. Now, here's a great example. These are all sea lions. The sea lions on the left of your screen are an American commercial exhibitor under a USDA license permit to exhibit. They go across country, usually to fairs and other small venues, to display sea lions in a performing setting. They have temporary pools, temporary caging, and they're, you know, in transit most of the time as they journey from coast to coast. People pay to go see them. It's a popular attraction, and many jurisdictions permit them coming in or actually not coming in. We actually had a similar exhibitor try and come into Marin. We had to issue them permits. It was very difficult, but nevertheless, they're going to say that these animals are ambassadors of all the marine mammals out there in the sea. On your right is a naturally occurring ambassadorship of sea lions that literally took over a very, very busy harbor in San Francisco at a tourist attraction, Pier 39. If you ever visit San Francisco, you'll come to see them. And not only did all of the fishing boats and tour vessels have to leave these docks because they're federally protected in America, as they should be, but the public now comes to see the sea lions at Pier 39. And what the nice thing about this naturally occurring ambassadorship is that educational messages can be put up there. Park Service people have educated people. People are aware of what they really do in their environment. And every once in a while, there will be one that will show up with a fishing hook or a net of some kind. And not only does 1 or 2 people care about getting it, but we have an entire population of people that are going to be advocating for that one animal and getting that one animal help. So in this regard, I think the use of naturally occurring wildlife viewing as an opportunity to educate is probably much more far-reaching than the venue you see on the left. Now, and I have to say congratulations to all of my friends and colleagues in Canada. You are light years ahead of us in America on a lot of these captive marine mammal issues and a lot of the exotic animal issues. But when we look at which message is trying to be promoted here, I have to ask, when we have an orca that's living, terribly stressed life in captive environments, what is that message to the general public that's going to be seeing him, display stereotypic behavior, not understanding what that stereotypic behavior is? Are they just excited to see a whale up close? What kind of message can compare possibly to the wonderful experience, off the shores of Canada, to wild whales in their natural behavior, doing natural behaviors and not in a captive environment? And what we've seen is the newer generations have zero tolerance for a lot of the captive issues and really have become natural conservationists. And we can look at films like Free Willy and Blackfish, and the more we're educating our younger population, the more they get how important not having them in captive environments is, as well as really promoting conservation messages. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't do this topic without a little extra drama. And, this is not the message we want the public to see. And yet it is so difficult to put an end to these kinds of mixed messages. And Joe Exotic and Tiger King, when you look at the issue at hand, there's this fascination that people really want to be up close and personal with these beautiful creatures. They are very beautiful, but we all know that they're the wrong species to be having that kind of activity with. But we find in animal law enforcement is the more these messages are getting put out there, the more harder and difficult our job as enforcement officers has to regulate, to prohibit, to educate the public on why it's not a problem. And there's just a lot of controversy over, how animals are used and who gets to have them and how we get to use them. And so this is just a really good reminder that we're up against some really tough opponents that do a great job in marketing. And so we have to be equally aware of that and be ready to confront it all the time. And, I'm really happy to see that a lot of the zoos and accredited sanctuaries, the sanctuaries that do a really great job, are really with us on trying to end these messages and really get the correct facts out, which is encouraging. And of course, there's always a darker side of these people that claim to be conservationists, conserving species, breeding to release. Rarely does that ever happen. I really can't tell you one group that I know of is breeding tigers to be released, but that's their claim. And when you have people paying to go see these venues, when you have people believing that what they're saying is true, it really makes the messaging hard for us to tackle. And what they don't know is all the layers of problems behind it. Just like we see tiger petting of baby tiger cubs as being big business, not just in America, but all over the world. There's tremendous connections with illegal crime syndicates. And, it's not just these people out in your backyard. This is a big time, well-funded, well-lobbied group of individuals. And when they get good PR and good, messaging points, it makes it harder for us to really get the real picture out of there. So where do these ambassador animals show up? Now, this is the other interesting part because they've really morphed into a lot of different places that you wouldn't maybe expect to see them. And one of the surprising factors I've actually seen some of them use is this whole mode of therapy animals, where they go into senior centers to provide social enrichment for the residents by using, camels, parrots, reptiles, you name it, for quote therapeutic purposes. I think it's also fair to say that the AZA and well accredited zoos are not so much putting animals out on the road. They do a really good job keeping educational messages behind their perimeters, but there are quite a few of these privately owned people that have exotic animals in their backyards and garages suddenly become exhibitors going from town to town, often underregulated. Often we never even know that they come into our counties, and they have huge followings, use a lot of social media. And so they're really showing up at a lot of places. And depending on where they go, you'll have differing messages, but it can be hard to keep tabs on all these places. And the messages that they're claiming are pretty much false. So let's take a look at the American side of the zoo industry through the Association of Zoos and Aquarium, which is the AZA, not the ZAA. And I'm not endorsing any of these organizations, but it's interesting to note that the AZA defines an ambassador animal as an animal whose role includes handling and or training by staff or volunteers for interaction with the public and in support of institutional and education and conservation goals. That sounds really nice on paper. I think we would all agree that that kind of makes sense. If you're a zoo, you're trying to educate the public about what animals are doing. But I think the other area that we're seeing quite a bit of significant changes around conservation. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go through these slides. So one of the things that you may not be aware of is that AZA actually has pretty formal policy, and they have a lot of different charters, but they actually have policies on ambassador animals, and they have an oversight committee through their conservation education committee that actually helps with this oversight and policy. And they have accreditation standards, as Rod mentioned. I would say they're probably in America our gold standard from a zoological perspective. And so it's a good starting place if we're looking at having to regulate these venues or looking at how we should go about it. One of the things that is interesting to me is that they have 3 different scenarios: the use of their animals within the animals enclosure, the use of animals outside that exhibit but still on the zoo property, and then off ground. And I think it's fair to say that AZA facilities generally don't do the volume of off-ground visits as some of these other private venues are. But they're also really responsible for their internal policies that justify the species that are used and what their management program is for that species and what are their educational objectives. And I think that's what makes this kind of a standout for me, is that there's a lot more thought that goes into selection and management and care, which is certainly nice to see. As part of their accreditation standards, these are the broad areas that they're looking at. They go very deeply into very much specific stuff, but it's kind of what Rod mentioned earlier around the essence of the 5 freedoms that I definitely support as well. And with any species, you can look at where they're maybe lacking or where they've done a really good job. Just like when you go to any zoo, there are great enclosures that have everything that animal needs. And there's some, usually it will see that, have some improvements, and zoo folks will be the first to say that as well. And, I think hands up to the zoos that, take welfare as a priority We certainly have enough roadside zoos and private menageries that don't see that as the main object. So the other part to this is what the education and conservation messages are. And so if they're using a species that does not have a conservation message that fits, that might not be an animal that they're going to use for ambassadorship. And it's also interesting to note, just as words matter, that in 2015, they changed the word from program animal to ambassador animal. So the other component to this is their ambassador animal scientific advisory group. And this is really, I think, a benefit to explore, what is the relationship between, education, research, animal welfare interests of the zoo and aquarium community around this topic. And it's enabled them to have conversations, to share resources, and to really look at what kind of experiences will fall in line with their policies. And, I think it also lends itself to a lot of education among their peers and other industries of interest. So I think that's a good framework. And we've seen that work well in other scenarios in America with other animal issues. Their primary functions are to emphasize the importance of ambassador animals in their education and to support professional standards and management and handling. And I think this is where, when we look at getting those resources that we love to compare for our enforcement and our own education, you get your hands on those standards, because it gives you kind of a baseline of where to start for certain species. And I think the other thing is we've learned a lot more about wildlife and exotic animals over the years. And this is kind of a bank for all of that research and findings to be able to be in one spot where they can be shared, and we can continue to make things better in these animals' lives. Okay, and it just happens by chance I have this beautiful lemur on the picture of this slide. One of the things that they also do is they support the Ambassador Animal Resource and Information Center. This may have been familiar to some of you before as the Paris spot. And if you go to aaric.org, it's a wealth of information. One of the things I was really pleased to see is they don't approve of any primates, including lemurs, as ambassador animals that are specific to mobile transportable situations. But in those documents, you can find species specific information, the kind of messaging they're trying to work on for the ambassadors. And I think just like we've seen in the pet shop world, we use the pet shop industry standards as guideposts. This might be a good resource for some of you looking for information on specific animals. And while I'm talking about lemurs, you may have heard Maki from the San Francisco Zoo was stolen this couple weeks ago. It was terrible. People broke into the zoo, actually grabbed him. He was an older lemur. He was unaccounted for about 3 days, and actually showed up on a schoolyard in a nearby city. And then fortunately was returned to the zoo unharmed. And the suspect that is believed to have done the alleged crime actually was arrested in the county that I work in, Marin County. So that's a little drama, but I always question, why does someone feel the need to have to break into a zoo to steal a lemur in the first place? And I think when we see a lot of these private ambassador conservation groups traveling, people get really excited when they see these animals. And it's kind of a fascinating note that the zoo also had koala bears stolen a number of years ago. So as these species become popular and special, drives this need to have one yourself. So some of the places that AZA mentions in their offsite visiting locations are all the places you would expect. Some may not so much in the ones I have listed here. I think the other thing to be aware of is some of these are truly partnerships for fundraising tools or marketing tools, especially when we look at PR events and corporate events, especially here in California. Those two go hand in hand. Many of our zoos are run by nonprofit groups that need funding. And so they really rely on good PR. But then when you look at things like the nursing home visits and hospital visits and senior centers, I don't know how much of a stretch that is from where the facilities reside, but certainly, it's equally important for them to get their messaging out to different groups as we in the animal welfare profession do in ours. And I guess one would have to ask, what's the suitability, depending on the species, of the various venues? Certainly with reptiles and animals that can pose potential disease risks, I'm not sure going into a hospital setting would be valid. Certainly nowadays with COVID, it's stopped just about all of these off-site locations, which is I guess a silver lining blessing in disguise. But when non-COVID is around, I don't think there's any place that couldn't be a potential venue for many of these. Let's talk a little bit about wildlife rehab centers. And again, these are great places because they're doing an amazing job, fixing broken wings and all the troubles that wildlife find themselves in. But they're dealing with native wild animals, which is different than imported non-native species, although occasionally they will get involved with non-native species. But the difference is they're looking at animals that may have been orphaned, may have become sick or injured. They're all supposed to be, at least in California, working under fish and wildlife permits, have standards of care. And many of them have these ambassador permits as well, separate from their rehabilitation permits, that allow them to put on display their non-rehabilitatable animals or animals that they find suitable. In this case, this is a bird that's been in captivity for over 22 years that came without the ability to fly. Their non-releasable policies vary greatly. And many of these policies are dictated by state authorities, but more importantly, people are deciding the fate of these animals. And there is some consistency with the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council of who's rehabilitatable, who isn't. But I think what we really need to look at is what is the reasoning and the rationale for taking in a non-releasable animal. And I think the big difference for many of the colleagues that I work with in this realm is if they were imprinted on humans versus the ones that just show up and don't have a choice. And that certainly becomes a deciding factor on who in the animal world makes a better ambassador. Now, this is an interesting one. As you may or may not know, we've been plagued with wildfires in California. It's been a brutal year. And our friends at Oakland Zoo, and by the way, I will put a plug into the Oakland Zoo. They are great friends. They've done amazing work on advocacy and passing, good laws with us. But they actually became the recipient of Captain Cal, who's being worked on the slide to the right. Captain Cal was one of the many victims of one of the big fires we had up in Northern California this year. And he was transported to them for care. And then just about a week or two later, 2 more little orphaned mountain lion cubs were brought to them. So we now have 3 native wild mountain lion babies that are going to be, rehabilitated from the burn injuries. They're going to be in good hands at the zoo for now. But the question will be, where do they end up and what will their job be? Will they be in a captive zoo environment? Will they end up in a sanctuary somewhere? Or will they end up, in a roadside zoo, a mobile live animal program? And so all of their fate lies in policymaking and regulators to dictate, their future, which can be scary. If they should end up in the wrong hands, what are we doing to address that? If they end up in great hands, how do we make that happen more? And these are everyday things that are happening with wildlife rehab that we really need to be aware of. Now, I think there's a good connection with wildlife and storytelling. And you may all remember that Australia was, just like California is now, plagued with some tremendously difficult fires. And, some of these very specialized species were really at risk. And I think what's really exciting with the public part of this is they really want to get behind helping animals whenever there's an opportunity. And when these fires broke out, we saw that. We saw that around the world, but we also saw that in the zoo community. And, just to take a look at the koala side of the picture, because people were so worried and, concerned about koalas, it morphed into this huge outpouring of support that resulted in over 400 volunteers that were helping work with the conservation officials in South Wales, to go in and actually rescue the koalas that hadn't been burned yet, to save them. There were many that had been radio collared, but it really took a village. We had zoos that opened up their doors for the koalas to stay. We saw a lot of fundraising all over the world, to help South Wales with this issue with their koalas. It was really a positive message. And the message was, we need your help to not only save the existing koalas that were, not in the burn zone, but we need your ongoing support for their habitat, because, not just rescuing the animals, but they had no place to go back to. It was burned. And as you know, they're browse-oriented creatures, very specialized. And so they captured that moment to help the public get to work by sending the zoos and where they were being held, browse. This was all done so that the koalas could go back to their environments. They set up water stations. And it's just a really happy story about, what an ambassadorship those koalas became in a time when we were so worried about their welfare. And so many were saved, even though a third of all the koalas in South Wales were impacted. So it just goes to show you that if we ask our public to step up and to message what the message is, in this case, it was all about not just the animal, but their habitat, their diets, how we needed help from volunteers. And so kudos to South Wales and all of the great folks behind that project, because it was really well done. And I think it's fair to say that the koala bear became not just an ambassador, but really helped save all the other species that depend on that same habitat. So one of the interesting things, a lot of the animal shelters, maybe some of you on this call, have your own wildlife rehabilitation centers as part of your animal services role. We took the liberty just to check in with some of our American colleagues that do wildlife rehab to see, where do they fit on, the scale of, is this something we should be promoting or not promoting? And it was, I have to say, a mixed bag. We have, animal shelters that, for the first quote, we do not treat them like pets and they don't have cute names. When people hear their individual stories, I believe they help to create a bridge to our wildlife protection efforts. That's kind of an interesting message, because that's the same message many of the zoos are using, as well as maybe many of the mobile live animal programs. That whole essence of relying on a story to tell is interesting. The second one here was the one that's kind of different from the others we received. And that is that our mission is to keep wild animals wild. So we will humanely euthanize an animal if it cannot successfully be rehabilitated to live and fend for itself back into the wild. That seems to be the message many of these facilities have. And again, I think it's dictated with what the mission of the organization is. The last one here was really excited about, the fact that they do have ambassador animals and, really believe strongly about them. They use them in their own events. They bring them to classrooms. They use them in fundraising. And they have over 40, what they term as education ambassadors. And they seem, quote unquote, seem to do well with the education mission. So, just goes to show that we have varying philosophies within our own realms, and it's always good to take a look at that. Speaking of our own philosophies, I will share this story because it challenged our own internal philosophies at Marin Humane. Probably around 15, 16 years ago, we had a new senior manager join our team. She was very involved in wolf conservation, loved wolves, like we all love wolves, but she was over the top on enjoying wolves, to the point that she wanted us to bring in a live wolf to do an educational program for the public. And our philosophies hadn't changed in decades. We're really not so pro on having wild animals come to our community, much less to our campus. But our executive director at the time tasked all of us with trying to have this program come to the shelter. We'll open up to the public, and we'll use it as a stepping stone to see how we all feel about our philosophies, whether they need to be updated or changed, and to really take a good look at how it goes. Of course, I'm probably the one at the opposite end of the scale that was in total opposition. I was really upset that we would even consider this, but I had to surrender my own personal philosophies to basically go into fact investigative mode, which is exactly what I did. And so we invited this vendor to come up to our shelter. We had about 100 people from the public in our auditorium. They brought a live wolf. They had 2 handlers. They had a table on stage, and the wolf was asked to jump up on the table. And they did their presentation about what wolves do and what wolves need in the wild, and all those things you would normally expect. When suddenly, and this is where the story kind of goes sadly off kilter, there was a young toddler that was in the aisle. It probably wasn't the best venue to bring a young child, but that wolf latched on to that kid and went into what they categorize as a prey stance, ready to just pounce off that table. And I saw it. My blood pressure rose really quite a bit. I was ready to jump out of my chair, but just by the time anybody realized what had happened, the 2 handlers ended up pulling that wolf off the table, rolling her on her back, both people on top of her. It was so scary and so awful. And all of a sudden, all of the people in attendance were, ohing and awing and didn't know what to expect. And for the handlers, probably very embarrassing. They had to explain what just happened, which is exactly what you probably all know, that, the wolf was in one of those modes where they better get quick and careful control over her, which they did. It was a little over the top on how they did it, but it put them in a position to have to explain. And so for me, I'm glad no one was injured or eaten, but, to go back to our senior management team and say, it wasn't so good. This is why we oppose this very thing on our campus. And it kind of solidified and validated, our position. But I guess the cherry on top would be that a number of years later, I hired one of our animal services officers, and she looked very familiar. I couldn't figure out how I'd known her before. And we hired her. She was a great officer. And she confessed, you know why I look familiar, don't you? I was one of the handlers with that wolf. And we kind of laughed, but she very, very much validated that was an impossible outfit to work for. A number of animals they had were impossible to control. They had problems like that all the time. And so she was really glad to end up in the enforcement side of exotic animals. And so that's just kind of a nice little example to challenge sometimes our own philosophies. So what have we done legislative? I think as both Rod and Michele went over in vivid detail, I guess I have some work to do because we have lots of bans. We have had a permitting ordinance as long as I've been there, over probably 42 years before me. And what's nice about it is we have some regulatory authority to dictate what can happen and what can't happen. So when for instance, the sea lion encounter wanted to come to town, they wanted to come all the way from Florida across the country to Marin, we actually said no. And we demanded that, a closer option be made available if the fair wanted to do that. So we've had really good success in regulating these displays. We about 4 or 5 years ago actually had a species specific ban throughout our entire county. All of our cities passed. There was no opposition. Everybody in our county pretty much gets it, but we still were getting a lot of out of area mobile live animal programs wanting to come through. So we really kind of just focused on the species that we're most concerned about, the large cats, the dangerous types of animals, and then more of the animals that are special species of concern that have very specific care requirements. So with each permit we issue, we have to actually spell out what they can and can't do, which is a lot of work, but it really has been nice to see. And, it kind of comes in line with what we're seeing around the world as, circuses are ending wild animal displays. And, the public is very aware of animal welfare and public safety issues. All that's going on all over. But I think what we sometimes forget is that our local bylaws and ordinances are some of the most effective tools. And if you especially get your own community's buy-in, it's very, very powerful. And we've seen a lot of success with those. Now, I'm the first to say, I've been doing this a long time. And while I'm very excited about my job every day, I can sometimes get a little bit pessimistic, especially when it comes to looking at laws and what we think we can do and what we have done. But I have to say, I've been fortunately been proven wrong so much in the last 4 years that I think truly anything is possible. Just to give you a little preamble before we talk about this most recent victory, we've had some amazing state laws passed in California, and none of them were easy. But, I think it started when at the second attempt to try and ban bull hooks used on elephants in circuses, when we finally got that law passed several years ago, that was probably the best victory. We were all so excited. It really led to elephants getting out of circuses, at least in America, and for sure in California. But then just last year, we saw an end to trophy hunting of bobcats, which I never thought I would see. And then we saw a ban on cosmetic testing of animals in California, which I never thought I would see. And then the icing on the cake would be a ban on fur products. I remember laughing to myself thinking none of these bills are going to have a chance. And not only was I happily proved tremendously wrong, but they passed overwhelmingly. And so that led to, this most recent wonderful law just passed last year that took exotic animals out of circuses completely in California, which couldn't have happened soon enough because we've seen such hideous abuse of these venues. But I have to say, it was really an interesting process. We started out wanting to ban every exotic animal that could ever be on display. And, I think it's a good reminder that our public and legislators really know their stuff a lot of times, and they're going to dictate that process. So the bill had two sponsors, that are very active in high profile legislative actions. And I think one of the big successes was their diligence and getting, a really strong coalition of different agencies together on it. In this case, over 19 agencies joined this effort. We were all unified in our messaging. And originally this bill, as I mentioned, targeted all exotics on display. And we wanted, the mobile live animal programs, we wanted the therapy animals, and it didn't go quietly. There was fierce opposition, fierce like lion and tiger fierce people. zoos, licensed exhibitors, unlicensed exhibitors, private pet owners, people that just wanted to go and view an animal. I mean, they really, really rallied, which, you know, we expected, but not to the degree that they showed up actually to the Capitol. This resulted in over 300 entities, including, I'd never heard of this, but a camel dairy. Who knew? You know, down in Southern California, camel dairies are unfortunately becoming popular. So what ended up happening is, you know, there was no way this bill was going to go through unless we removed the, you know, mobile live animal program operators and just focuses on circuses. So once that amendment was made, they joined us in our opposition, which was quite funny because, you know, these folks are not ever on the same side as us. And in this case, they were, and that bill passed without any opposition. And so we're happy to say that exotics and circuses in California are no longer. But through that process, there were some very interesting arguments from the opposition, which really required us to know what they were concerned about. And my favorite all-time one was the second one, where they basically said animals have been trained and desensitized to travel happily and comfortably, much as a child in a car seat. Well, as you all probably know, that's far from the reality. You know, there are endless hours in travel in, you know, makeshift conditions most of the time, filthy conditions, but we didn't let that stop us. And so it was constantly lobbying and letter writing and phone calls. You know, these entities were threatening they would go out of business, and that, you know, the studies show, you know, all those things that you would expect. So just be aware, they can mobilize really easily. We also had to really take a look at understanding their issues. And in this case, this is just one vendor, you know, that claimed a lot, but claimed, you know, hundreds of visits a year and millions of children reached. And when you look at what the fees they were charging, anywhere from $250 for a 10-minute visit all the way up to, you know, $2,500 and higher, you know, for maybe a 30-minute visit. And so that had an economic ring to it that, you know, legislators never like to see, putting businesses out. But what's also interesting to note, while they were claiming that, they were also just under $1 million in revenue for that year. And what we didn't know at the time, which we know now, is that particular venue, their charity nonprofit status has been delinquent. Those are the things we wish we knew at the time. So I think, you know, just a reminder, when you look at trying to work with your opponents and getting these laws passed or policies changed, is really to be mindful of understanding all sides. You have to be willing to listen and adjust. And, you know, I know there's some great people out there that are very active, but you have to be a people person to be able to use those soft skills that, you know, make people feel heard, that you're willing to compromise. You can't personalize it, as much as difficult as that is, and it is. You have to rely on facts, not emotion. There's a lot of emotion in a lot of these hearings that come up. And I think what legislators and policy keepers really appreciate is relying on facts and science and just sticking to the issue and not going off track on emotion. You know, having really strong counterpoints and arguments in advance, and, you know, just staying calm and focused. And I also have to just say, if you do have success in getting these laws passed, remember the thank you. The art of thanking is really important. A lot of these people are staff members to legislators, but I think that's important for us as an animal group to just remember. Couple examples here. This was Ben. Ben was in a terrible roadside attraction for many years, and our wonderful friends at PAWS, which is in Northern California, an animal sanctuary that we love working with, they rescued Ben. And so really looking at how do we regulate, what's the proper scheme to get full protection, you know, all of these things, from engaging stakeholders to using inspections. will say trying to find independent experts from an enforcement perspective can be difficult. A lot of folks, especially in the zoo industry, are sometimes reluctant to get involved, but there are ways to find them and use them. And just really know that it's going to be impossible to make changes on your own. We really need to work together to make lives better for these animals. One of the newer strategies that I'm excited about is, the whole art of civil litigation, where we're actually filing lawsuits against some of these situations. In this case, Tony the tiger, unfortunately, was in litigation with the Animal Legal Defense Fund here in California for over 7 years. He died before being rescued, which is an understatement of how important these cases are, and how widespread the problem is. And they're tough. You have to be willing to go the distance. You have to be able to have strong lawyers and lobbyists and endless arguments. But seeing that we can actually do something as citizens and people as being involved has been really exciting. Marin Humane has been involved in several high-profile big civil litigation cases, from saving wild horses from slaughter, to we're currently working on poultry line speed litigation. So this is something encouraging that will really help make a difference in a positive direction. And then lastly, one of the things I'm really excited to see is this whole use of turning our native wild animals into their own ambassadors in our own backyard, whether it's teaching people about how to watch birds in their backyard, to developing habitats for butterflies, to zeroing in on these new trail cams and radio collared GIS tracking devices. People love this. Marin County has a group called One Tam. They've had over 1 million photo camera trap photos taken. They use volunteers to track every animal. These are both pictures that were taken off their site. And what we find is the public loves this stuff. Some of the zoos have webcams. You can tune in to watching bears splashing around in their pool environments. The eagle cams that show nesting eagles out in the wild. So these are all new ways to look at, how do we turn from captive wild animals into the animals truly in all of our backyards, and letting them be the ambassadors for our environment, for our conservation efforts, for educational messages. And, we know, as we're doing today, we know that virtual learning is here to stay. And, people from all over the world get to share in these fascinating and wonderful experiences right in the comfort of your home through the use of good technology, which is exciting. I'm happy to always keep in touch with you. Those are my desk phone number, and most importantly, my email, which is the best way to reach me. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. It's about the only social media I'm at. And again, I appreciate and enjoy being part of this panel today and have your interest. And with that, I'm going to toss the baton back to Cassandra for hopefully some questions.
Yes, we absolutely have a couple of questions for you. The first one is from an anonymous attendee. As someone who worked with offsite animal ambassadors in the past, I've experienced the mixed feelings about animal welfare versus educational value. One thing I struggled with was knowing when and how to vocalize my concerns, knowing I wouldn't be well received by management. Do you have any advice for people in a situation like this? That's a really great question.
Oh, I thank you for putting that question out. I feel your pain and agony. It's so true. We see that all the time. I'm getting shivers from that question. So good job, Anonymous. That was actually the case of the officer I mentioned in the wolf story, and I actually have 3 employees that have worked with exotic animal, they weren't roadside zoos, but they're basically mobile live animal programs that travel up to, 4 miles to different venues. And they will all say the same thing, which is, at some point their pain of the philosophical issues overcame their need to do that job and they changed professions. One really relied on trying to have discussions over, which animals weren't doing well while others were doing well. And unfortunately for all three of them, the venue operators just didn't care. It was profit-motive business, not a mission-based business. If you are in a mission-based business, I think one of the things that we're seeing is the more we know about animals and their specific needs, the more we know we have to change. Look at elephants in zoos. That's probably one of my favorite ones to look at, including, the Toronto elephants that were shipped to the Paw Sanctuary. At some point, we realized we just can't provide what they need. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because it's realizing that we're learning more about animals. We're looking at, their behavior, their brain, their science behind their physiology. Like, there's amazing things like that happening. So I would say hang in there. Definitely join up some of those coalitions of others to share findings. Reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you, privately as well. But good luck. It's a terrible position to be in.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Okay, the next question is from Chris Hydro. Do both IWRC and NWRA offer permits for wildlife rehabilitation?
I'm sorry, was that do they?
Yeah. Do they
Yeah.
do both? Yeah.
So tell me this, the NWRA and the IWRA?
The IWRC and NWRA offer permits for wildlife rehabilitation.
That's a question I'm not completely sure of. I believe they have policies on it, but I don't know that they're an actual regulating entity. At least in California, it's through the state Fish and Wildlife. Most of our states have their own statewide, unless it's a federally protected bird, but they both should have actual policies about it.
Okay, great, thank you. And one last question we have here. What do you think the greatest animal welfare threat for animals is with the MLAPs?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. Thank you. Thank you for posing that. I struggle with that question because I see tremendous problems with public safety and equally troubling problems with animal welfare. And so both combined, I think in my experience, it's just this disaster waiting to happen. We've seen terrible problems from these venues, from escaped animals to, handlers being bitten, in front of a group of 30 kids. I actually had a guy that was displaying a bobcat that actually had a bobcat latch onto his arm doing a media interview on live TV. So I think what really comes down to is to ask the whys, like, why is it being done and what needs to happen to make it safer, better, or just find other technologies. It's kind of like circuses were a dying entity. There's so much more great entertainment than what circuses provide. Kids will find amazing new ways to learn. They're doing it now. So I'm troubled with both the animal welfare, safety, and human health and safety, from petting reptiles and not having hand sanitizing or hand washing systems to sticking tiger cubs in people's, faces. It's just all bad. There's a great room for improvement on that one.
That's great. Thank you for that answer. So I think that's it for the, I think that's it for the questions. I just want to thank you again for your presentation. It was really, really interesting and certainly lots of food for thought.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, so we're just about to head into the final speaker of the day. And I just want to quickly introduce Dr. Scott Weese. Dr. Weese is a veterinary internist and a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. He's a professor of the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph, not too far from us, and director of the University of Guelph Center for Public Health and Zoonoses, and chief infection control at the Ontario Veterinary College Teaching Hospital. So lots of really interesting things, I think, to talk to us about today. So Scott, I'm just going to turn off my video and mute myself and give you control of the presentation.
Great, thanks a lot. I don't think I have control yet if that's what you're trying to do. Okay, there we go, maybe. Okay, so yeah, we're almost out of time. So I'm gonna have to kind of ditch most of my presentation. I'll hit on a few of the highlights and then try to lead into a few minutes for questions, since we've only got about 15 minutes left, it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the disease side. We've talked about a lot of areas, and disease has come up quite a few times, and I'm really going to just focus on that component of it. And really, I think one of the concepts we have to realize that every time we interact with an individual, there's some risk, whether that's a person or an animal. And the risks are different with different interactions. So the risk status of the individual, you, and the risk status of the individual you're interacting with. And when it comes to animals, that can be really variable. We have some species that we understand quite well, and we know what their risk is. We have some species that we understand quite well, we know they're high risk. And we have a lot of species we know very little about. So there are certain species or certain situations where we know there is substantial risk. But there are a lot of situations we just don't understand. And the way we find out about a lot of these new things is when people get sick or people die. Infection control is inherently very reactionary. Something bad happens and then we do something, which is the opposite of the way it should be, but that's just, you know, the way it is. So that's the concept of zoonotic diseases I'm coming around to. So these are diseases that are transmitted from animals to people, and they're common. And when we talk about exotic pets, there are kind of two big areas to think about. One is disease risks that occur from bringing those animals into the country, because some of the exotic pets are being bred in the country and some are being imported. So that importation event creates some risk. And then there's just that inherent risk of interacting with the animal. It doesn't matter what its source was, it could be locally sourced, the risks that come along with that. Really quickly, just on the importation side, this is where we get into bringing in things that's just we know are problems or we just don't know exist. And that's a big thing. If we look at emerging diseases, people, about 60 to 70% of them are animal in origin. And these can be kind of small things, but they can also be some of the biggest problems we're dealing with. And one of those would be COVID, right? This is an animal-associated disease that jumped into people, not from a pet, but still came from an animal and now caused the pandemic. Just like the other two coronaviruses that have emerged in the last 20 years, the original SARS and the MERS virus, and HIV, Zika virus, Ebola virus. These are all animal origin viruses. Avian influenza is an inherent risk of moving birds around. There's always some risk of that, predominantly with poultry, but it can be more broad. And things can range from, you know, someone dealing with an individual sick person from an animal that's imported, to dealing with a local outbreak, to bringing in a new tick that can establish itself in an area and bring in diseases, or the start of a pandemic. So importing animals can result in fairly widespread problems, but just dealing with our local animals can too. And everything comes down to cost, benefit, and risk and reward, right? Every interaction comes with some risk. So what's the benefit to everyone that's involved? Is the benefit the person or the animal? What can we do to reduce that risk and maximize the benefit? And what risk remains? And how much risk can we accept comes along with that. Now, in general, when we're talking about zoonotic diseases, we can think about three big areas. There are risks specific to the individual animal species, and then there are risks specific to that individual animal, and then there are risks to the people. So animal species, we certainly know some species are higher risk. So you would put dogs at the pretty low risk area. Yes, we can get infections from them. We know dogs quite well. We know how to interact with them. We know preventive medicine. We can pick up things and prevent things. You know, get farther away, we get into reptiles. Reptiles and salmonella, that I'll hopefully have a chance to mention quickly. Big problem. Salmonellosis from reptiles, especially in kids, where it can cause fatal infections. So there's an inherent difference in different species. And if we don't know much about the species, then we don't know where to put them, so we kind of have to default them to that high-risk group. Individual animals. Well, some animals are at higher risk of being infectious than others, and that could be because they're very young, because young animals tend to carry more things. It could be because of their behavior. If they bite, we're looking at bite-associated infections. It could be because of their disease status. It could be from stress, from antibiotic treatment, things that happen to them in transit and breeding that increase the risk of shedding something infectious that can expose us. And then individual human risk, because not everyone's created alike. And there are some people that are going to get sick when they're exposed to things that doesn't cause disease in other people. And there's some people that are going to get seriously ill or die when they get exposed to things that might just cause mild disease. So we need to think about that. And all these things come together. So you get a reptile that's shedding salmonella and has been on antibiotics, and you get a neonate. That's the bad combination, right? You look at a dog, healthy adult dog that's well cared for, and a healthy adult person with no other disease. That's an exceptionally low risk environment. And there's a lot of in between, and there's a lot of unknown. And skip through a few things so we can get a little bit in here. Skip over that too. So high-risk species. So high-risk species, we look at reptiles and we look at amphibians as kind of the poster children for high risk. They're common and they're commonly associated with disease. Basically, neonates of any species, young individuals. Young individuals are more likely to harbor a range of bacteria and viruses and parasites. If it's animals where we have, house training, litter training, those animals are more likely to defecate on the floor or on you, contaminate the environment. They may be more likely to bite or scratch with less handling. Rabies reservoir species obviously are a huge issue. Species that we know harbor rabies, we certainly don't want contact with. And we often forget bites and scratches. We think about diseases and we talk about things like salmonella and specific bugs, but a bite is a serious issue in itself from the trauma, but also from the infection from all the different bugs that are in that animal's mouth or on your skin. If you get bitten and you get an infection from a bacterium that's on you, it's still the bite's fault, right? So that's still a zoonotic infection, even though it's your organism. So things that break our barriers like skin are problems. And then, like I've said a few times, anything with less baseline knowledge, the more I know about a species, the better I can prevent disease. The less I know, the less I can predict. And we certainly run into some scenarios that are highly unexpected and quite strange. And you can't prevent the unexpected very well. Now, at the person side, this gets into the people that were more worried about getting sick or more worried about getting seriously ill when they're exposed to things that wouldn't necessarily cause a problem in others. And these are the four groups that we basically talk about for everything in terms of high risk. Less than 5 years of age, over 65, pregnant women, especially in the third trimester, and immunocompromised individuals. So by disease or drug or something that weakens your immune system. And these are very, very common. If you look at the percentage of the population that fits into one of these groups, it's very high. If you look at household level, how often do households have at least one of these people in there? It's quite high. And it was mentioned earlier, right? The lifespan of some animals, especially some of these exotic animals that have long lifespans. Think about even just part of their lifespan. What are the odds someone in that household is going to fit into one of those groups? Well, it's exceptionally high, probably, right? By the time you've got babies coming in or people aging, pregnancy and disease and all these things, it's a large percentage of households may go through a transient or become a permanent event where they've got a high-risk person there. And we don't always think about that individual risk, and that's certainly an issue. Just examples of that, like I said, high-risk species, high-risk people less than 5 years of age, high-risk species, reptiles and amphibians. General recommendation is young kids shouldn't have contact with reptiles, kind of full stop. The risks are just too high for disease and serious disease. Yeah, kids like reptiles, they're interesting creatures. And we've talked about these before, these traveling encounters who certainly create risk. We don't know how much disease occurs, but there certainly is risk. And there certainly is behavior that doesn't make a lot of sense. There's risk and there's risk that you can intervene with, and they don't really try to intervene with this. You've got the snake around the neck is one thing. You've got that close contact kissing the reptile that's a salmonella vector. These kids are probably having lunch around this area later on. I don't imagine that's a litter trained reptile there. So we've got various issues we can see with reptiles. And some of these groups will market to that high-risk population, the young individuals or long-term care. We see groups that try to take exotic animals into long-term care facilities. And what's the benefit of that versus a dog? Like, we know low-risk dogs, we know how to handle them. We know how they work in these programs. And even, especially for long-term care, right? What are the odds this person in long-term care had a dog when they were growing up? Very high. This brings back a lot of discussion, brings back a lot of memories, good emotional aspects. What are the odds they had a snake or an iguana growing up? They didn't, right? Very, very unlikely. So the benefits of these, there's a novelty factor, but that's again, the cost benefit. What's the real benefit and what's the real cost? Because we know if we look at lists of outbreaks, we see a reasonable number of outbreaks from reptiles and amphibians and young poultry and some other things, but reptiles and amphibians are kind of classic ones. Turtles in particular, but a range of them, different lizards, we can see it from snakes. It tends to be more of the species that get handled more, not surprisingly. But if you talk to any infectious disease physician, they've got stories about salmonella and reptiles, and sometimes some really strange interactions that are there. Pet bearded dragons, a recent outbreak. This is one thing too that I think sometimes we need to reinforce. We say, okay, well, we shouldn't have reptiles in households with kids under 5. And I did this talk for a daycare group a couple of years ago. So I explained all the issues, and one came up to me afterwards and said, okay, I know you said they shouldn't be there, but if they stay in the cage, that's okay, right? Yeah, that's when I start banging my head against the wall. But no, the problem is you can keep the reptile in the cage, maybe, but you can't keep the salmonella in the cage. And this is just one example here. This is a turtle-associated salmonella septicemia and meningitis, so a bloodstream infection and meningitis, so potentially life-threatening disease in a 2-month-old baby. That baby obviously wasn't playing with the turtles, but what was in that terrarium or aquarium made it out and got to the baby. And that's not uncommon. We see a lot of cases of salmonella where there's not a direct link. So it's in the household, it gets out somehow through people's hands, or they're changing food bowls and rinsing out water bowls and the like. So you can't say, okay, well, the snake's in a terrarium and it's fine. This is just kind of another example, that bit of a weird one. This is a foodborne disease from bearded dragons. No, they weren't eating bearded dragons, but this is a church potluck, and someone made, I can't remember what it was, so they had gravy with it. And people got sick, and they did an investigation that was salmonella, and they found salmonella in the gravy. And they found the same salmonella in the bearded dragon in the house. And this was the owner's kid's bearded dragon. She didn't have anything to do with it, but the bearded dragon salmonella somehow made it into the kitchen, and then somehow made it into the food, which got improperly stored and made a lot of people sick outside of the house. Just again, showing that we can't rely on containment in terraria, in aquaria, in habitats to keep these things in. We can't ever rely on them to keep the animals in. We see enough escapes, but we definitely can't rely on them to keep disease away. And reptiles and salmonella, I could spend a couple hours talking about that. There's no doubt there's a link, and there's no doubt there's high risk. And we see the odd fatal infection of a kid that happens because of this. And if you look at just various surveillance studies looking at salmonella, it just kind of shows it here. So here's one in Alberta. A reptile was a suspected source in about 12% of cases of salmonella in kids. Food was 25%, reptiles were at 12%. How many kids have common contact with a reptile? Well, not 12%. So it's certainly, a risk factor there. And you can see it in different groups, different numbers, but it's fairly common. Tends to be more a lizard. This one is lizard then snake then turtle. Lizards tend to win. Turtles are often higher. But the common take home is that there's a disproportionate burden from reptiles compared to other pets. Skip over some of this too. So that kind of sets the scene. That's one of our big concerns, and we really have to pay attention to reptiles and amphibians and salmonella. Just an example, and I guess I'll probably have to wrap up with this. An example of the unknowns that can happen with legal trade. And illegal trade brings in a whole range of other unknowns, but this is a Gambian giant rat, a Gambian pouched rat. And this is a prairie dog. And this was a really interesting outbreak from, I guess, quite a few years ago now, of monkeypox that occurred in the Midwest and northern US. Monkeypox isn't actually carried by monkeys. It's just one of these diseases that has a really bad name. It's actually carried by rodents, including Gambian giant rats. And these guys are healthy when they're infected. They're a healthy carrier. So these were being legally imported into the US, along with various other small mammals. And they were being housed in these big warehouses where they're bringing animals together for the pet trade. And around the same time, prairie dogs were a fad pet. So they're being plucked out of prairie dog holes in the southern US and put in the same facilities. And what we know now, and something you never would have predicted, is that prairie dogs are very susceptible to monkeypox. So the Gambian giant rats were infecting the prairie dogs, not because they were being co-housed, but probably how they were managed in these facilities. Prairie dogs are going into households, and they were infecting people, and they're infecting veterinarians, and they're infecting pet store workers. So there's a reasonable size outbreak of this disease in people that have never been near Africa. And who's going to predict that, right? You can say this kind of comes back to the positive in the list approach to controlling wildlife. You can't say, okay, here are the diseases we're worried about, and here's what we're going to do for them, because you don't come up with monkeypox. You don't come up with a lot of strange things. You come up with salmonella, but you don't come up with everything we can get from something like a macaque or something like a kinkajou. Or hedgehogs, we know a little bit more, but you can't say, here are the list of threats, let's deal with them. We have to flip that around and say, what are the broad concerns that we have and how do we mitigate that? And again, what's the cost and what's the benefit? So it looks like we're pretty much out of time. So let maybe leave another minute or so for questions. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. That's the take-home message relaying with any animal.
Yeah, Scott, I think we could go over a few more minutes if there's a few more things you wanted to say. There are a couple of questions, but it's up to you. It's up to you. But if you want
people have questions, that might be the easier way.
Okay.
Looks like there's some coming in. I can kind of go back and hit on. I don't have a ton of time, honestly, either. And I'm sure people have been on a long time. You're going to lose your audience fairly quickly. It looks like we're down a lot already. But so why don't we stick with the questions, and then if there's anything that pertains to a slide, I can pop back to it. So I see a question here. Many are lobbying for restrictions on wildlife trade with the aim of preventing the spread of zoonotic pathogens, particularly focused on birds and mammals as emerging sources of viral diseases such as SARS or COVID. Do you feel the international trade in reptiles is a factor in the spread of things? Yeah, we don't know. And that's the problem, is I don't like it when I don't know. We certainly know reptiles and salmonella. And there are some other things, like there are different diseases, and we've seen a little bit more about them in breeding facilities in some of the places they originate. There's some parasitic diseases you can see. Salmonella certainly is the biggest burden. But the problem is, you don't know what's emerging until it emerges. Like we didn't know about Ebola virus until we had Ebola virus, right? We didn't know about COVID until 8 months ago. So the odds are we're going to get bigger problems from mammals because mammals are more closely related to us. And something that can infect another mammal is more likely to infect us than a reptile. But yeah, I think we have to be aware of it. And one of the issues with reptiles is there's so many of them, and they're so diverse, and their habitats are so diverse that you can't come up with and say, okay, here are all the risks we have to deal with. So I think, again, cost benefit and the unknown factor are two big things. What is the benefit of bringing in a different reptile species? So you can debate all you want about what species are appropriate as pets. But I think if you say, there's certain species that can at least be raised in captivity, because if they can be raised in captivity, then we're at least dealing with more knowns. Probably once they've been here and they've been through multiple generations of breeding locally, there are certain things they don't have anymore because they're not getting exposed maybe to the reservoir, which might be another animal or the environment. So I would say a captive bred iguana is probably much lower risk than a wild caught iguana, except maybe for salmonella or some of the things they might pass around themselves. But from the emerging disease standpoint, the less we can bring animals from their habitats into ours, because that's the big risk. Right? The emerging disease side is us going into animal habitats from ecotourism and urban expansion and hunting and bushmeat, things like that, or bringing animals into our habitats through pet trade and again, bushmeat, wet markets, hunting and things like that. So the more we can limit that cross contact into areas we don't have a lot of exposure with, the better. So I would say big emerging disease threat from a reptile is probably low risk, but probably isn't really a great threshold. And is there a big need for it? Like, what's the benefit of importing a lot more, like was mentioned earlier, ball pythons? There are a lot of ball pythons being bred in North America. Is there any benefit to bringing in new ones? I don't think you can argue the gene pool issue means we need to bring in more. I think this got a cheaper source of, it's easier to pay someone to harvest ball pythons in the wild and put them in a carrier and ship them here than it is to breed them properly. So getting kind of off topic there again, but so yeah, I think it's still an issue. I'm certainly most concerned about mammals. Birds, we certainly have issues with as well, with different things, avian influenza, there are a variety of fungal diseases. And where there's one, we've got to worry about the close relative that might be out there. So I pay attention to any species when it comes to emerging diseases.
There's a question about briefly addressing RHDV2.
Rabbit hemorrhagic disease. Yeah, so I guess this gets, well, we've got a lot of acronyms, assuming we're talking about rabbit hemorrhagic disease. That's less of a wildlife trade issue now that it's moved into. Now, this brings in another side of wildlife trade overall, and I think it was mentioned earlier about importing Newcastle disease, I think was mentioned in one of the earlier talks. We run the risk of a couple of things. When you move animals, you move their pathogens, right? And that could be a direct threat to us through a zoonotic disease. That could be an indirect threat to us through impacts on domestic animals, or it could be a threat to the wildlife population. And any threat to the wildlife population is an indirect threat to us too, because as you start to damage biodiversity, you maybe change the the nature of the pathogen animal interactions, right? So the more you impact biodiversity, maybe the more risk we have of something new emerging. So movement of animals, that's not the topic of this one, but movement of animals into other areas certainly does risk bringing in animal diseases as well. And some of those diseases could be pretty devastating. And that's why there's a lot of control of moving livestock, right? There's, because we don't want to bring in foot and mouth disease or anything like that. But there's less concern with other animals because we don't have production of the non-livestock species that gets concerned, even though, as we obviously see, when you bring in something to a wild population, you can certainly have a big issue. Question about intermittent shedding of salmonella by snakes and reptiles. Yeah, so it's basically the story there is if you take a snake and you culture it once for salmonella and it's negative, what I say is, okay, well, it's still positive, right? We just didn't get it this time, essentially. They'll intermittently shed, or they'll shed it at low levels. So basically, when you've got a bug that lives in its normal host, it's often got a good relationship with this host. So it may not be pumping out large numbers of it. It's kind of just hanging out there in the background. So sometimes these animals have kind of low burdens that we don't pick up with our normal methods, and we can pick them up with more sensitive methods. Sometimes it just matters of how much happens to be coming out because it's in their intestinal tract. Is there some coming out in feces today? Yes, no, it depends on various things. If you take a snake and you culture it, like I said, once and it's negative, you culture it every day or every week, you find odds are fairly high it's going to be positive. There was a small study from a few years ago, I think in Minnesota, where they basically did that. And they found that, pretty much every snake was positive if they tested a reasonable number of times. And that's the take home for here is we assume there's risk with every reptile and we don't test them. And we certainly don't advocate testing reptiles for salmonella because I'm never going to tell you your reptile is salmonella free. Maybe if we did 100 of them and you're not getting exposed to anything else. But snakes, there's another dynamic there too, is, they might actually get exposed because I did have a slide on that. If I can get back to my slides. I guess. So we've seen outbreaks of salmonella in people from feeder mice and rats. So animals that are being sold to feed the snakes. And this has been a big problem. There are a couple of big outbreaks over a few years ago was the last one where, there are companies that produced commercial numbers of frozen rats and frozen mice. And these were contaminated with salmonella. So people were getting salmonella from handling the individual mouse or from the snake. You can never really tell, but you're providing a constant seeding source for salmonella. So even if your snake was salmonella free, if it's eating anything like that that's coming from a commercial source, you might bring in salmonella. So all these things kind of come together is why we never say that there's no risk for salmonella. African swine fever, zoonotic disease risk potential. So as far as we know, no. The big concern about African swine fever, the minute one case is identified in North America, that's $1 billion plus hit probably. It's a massive impact. This has killed hundreds of millions of pigs. And so it's got a huge impact on the animal population. So a huge animal health issue, animal welfare issue, and a huge economic issue. Brings in big trade issues. So this is one, again, there's a lot of attention paid to importing pigs because this is a multi-million to billion-dollar issue if it comes in. There's less attention to pay to things that don't get as much attention, even though the ultimate impact might be as big. So from a human standpoint, from a disease standpoint, we're not worried about it. The human impact still can be pretty massive based on disruption of agriculture, especially in countries where they're highly dependent on that. So small holding pig operations has been a huge impact in China for some of the smaller operations, and something we don't want here basically for the large livestock production components.
And Scott, I have one final question for you, if that's okay, and then we'll let you go. The question is, do people with exotic pets also pose a disease risk when they leave home by carrying the pathogens on their clothes or on their bodies?
Yeah, that's a good question. Potentially. No, I don't think I've seen that link to it, but the problem is a lot of these things would be very hard to sort out, right? Because how do you find outbreaks? Well, you find links. So, if you got a restaurant and they're selling something that's contaminated, you get a bunch of people that are sick, you do food histories, everything linked back to that restaurant, bang, you got the diagnosis, right? If you've got one person that gets infected from one person, right? So if I've got a reptile and I infect someone I interact with, there's not much way they're going to find that source, right? It's a single case. They're not going to find me as a link. The food history questionnaire is like the salmonella questionnaire is going to be a food history questionnaire. So they're looking at food sources. they're not going to find it. We know salmonella can be tracked on clothing. We have seen it go, for example, from veterinary hospitals home and infect kids. So that's been fairly clearly shown. It's uncommon, but it's happened. So you can get things on your clothes. I would be concerned most with a daycare, right? Or a healthcare worker if they're wearing their clothing home. So I think it certainly is a plausible risk, and it comes down to why we focus a lot of things on hygiene. But to be honest, it's not something that I typically talk to people about, asking them what you do, and do you wear your whatever, do you handle your animal before you go off to work in the morning? It's a good point. Probably should be thinking more about that, because there probably is some risk. We would just have no idea how to figure it out.
That's great, thank you. And I appreciate you hanging in with us till the end here and taking a few more questions. I actually find this topic really fascinating myself. Research that we've done with our supporters around disease risk and do they feel that they have it with their pet snakes in particular. And I think because salmonella is not considered a deadly disease and it's something that they overcome, that the responses we were getting is, well, I could get salmonella from lettuce, so whatever, and it's such a strange response to me when you're considering, purchasing an animal that could potentially give you that kind of disease. So I find this topic really fascinating. So thank you for joining us today. Okay, so again, thanks for hanging in, everybody. We really appreciate it, and for joining our seminar today. And we hope that we'll see you at our final session on October 28th. If this is your last registered session, please take a minute to fill out our post-event survey. That we would really appreciate the feedback. It's really valuable to us as we plan these again. And you'll receive a link in the post-event survey. And lastly, the recordings and resources will become available in early November. So presentations and all of these recordings will be available then. So thanks again, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon. The sun has finally come out in Toronto, and have a great day.